Hi there, if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel so you never miss an upload. The Blacksmith's Inconvenient Bride by Mallory Ford. Chapter 1. Early Fall 1887. Mud Lake, Colorado. The explosion seemed to shake the foundations of the world around them, dust falling on Carter's head from his makeshift smithy at the base of the mine. The structure was built into the side of a hill a few hundred yards away from the entrance to the mine. Next to it was where they cleaned their bounty, and closer up were the rows of bunkhouses where most of the men stayed. Any type of explosion without warning meant someone was hurt or worse, and Carter's blood ran cold at the sound and the telltale smell of soot, ash, and smoke. He tossed the tools he'd been cleaning onto the dark wood table where they landed with a clang and started moving towards the sound before the screaming even started. Hayes. One of the foremen shouted his name in between barking orders at other men. Go get the doctor. Hayes, get over here. Still clad in his dark leather apron, stained with a thick layer of soot and grime, Carter shifted into the role he'd done his best to leave behind in Chicago. It felt like a lifetime ago when he'd rounded the halls of one of the most prestigious hospitals in the country, a lifetime of anger and pain. Still, when a man's life hung in the balance, he'd do what he needed to do. I need clean water and whatever first aid items we have. 3 men carried George Blake out of the mine shaft as Carter shouted. Mama, George croaked between whimpers as they looked for a spot to set him down. Mama. Tears rolled down the man's face as he continued to call for his mother. The sound always tore at Carter, grown men crying for their mothers, the same as the stories he'd heard his father tell from the battlefield. Place him there, Carter said as he cleaned his hands the best he could with the water bucket someone placed in front of him. At least they'd added soap, something he'd finally managed to get through their heads after one too many infected wounds. Careful, don't jar him at all. George's shirt was scorched through in places, but Carter needed to remove the rest to get a good view. The sun blazed overhead despite the cooler nights of September. In fact, the day was beautiful, as though mocking them for the tragedy lying before them. Birds glided through the sky, and rabbits hopped across the field in the distance, unconcerned with the man's life hanging in a tenuous balance. Yanking the knife from his pocket, Carter cut a clean line through the rest of George's shirt, careful to avoid hitting any of the raw and bubbling skin. Mama, George whimpered as he fell in and out of consciousness. I want my mama. Knowing good and well George's mother had died a few months before he'd come out to work the mines, Carter shook his head. Not today, George. Not if I have anything to say about it. Working quickly and gently, Carter poured the cool water from the bucket over George's wounds. I need the coldest water you can find, he said to the closest man, a kid of no more than 20 who looked ready to vomit. Go up the trail a few yards and get it from the creek. The creek's water was the cleanest they had, as it came from the melted snow atop the mountain. And hurry. George drifted into consciousness again, his eyes rolling a little at the contrast of the cool water and burned skin made his body shake. See, cold. It's supposed to be, brother. It's going to stop the skin from burning further. At least, he hoped. Cleaning the wound and removing all the bits of soot, dirt, and burned fabric from it was imperative, but he didn't have any of the tools to do that here at the mine. Dr. Collins would bring his bag, and Carter could simply assist. Over the next few minutes, Carter continued to ladle the cold water over George's torso, wishing he was still a praying man. That ship had sailed long ago, but it would certainly come in handy in moments like these. The sound of a wagon approaching had him breathing a sigh of relief. Dr. Ethan Collins ran forward with a pretty blonde woman beside him, both calmly stoic in their appraisal of the situation. That's it, George, Carter said as Ethan and Grace drew closer. Doc will be here soon. Just keep breathing with me. The slight pressure of a hand on his shoulder pulled his attention to Ethan, where he dropped to the ground beside him. Thanks, Carter, I'm here now. This is my nurse, Grace. Carter stood, moving over to make room for Ethan and held out a hand to the nurse. Her eyes widened at first, not an uncommon response for those first meeting him, but it was the slight tremble in her shoulders which had him stepping back. He'd always been tall, nearly 6.5 feet, but apprenticing under the blacksmith at a logging camp back east had brought a bulk to him. It was understandably intimidating. With another step back to give the woman some space, he nodded quickly. "Nice to meet you, ma'am. Carter Hayes." "Doc, how can I help?" This was the woman who'd come to town after being attacked in New Orleans, where the other women had come from. The town rumor mill was strong, and he couldn't even remember where he'd heard it from. Probably at church. Why he still went, he honestly didn't know. It had been a long time since he thought God was anything more than a disinterested deity at best, but something about the weekly practice brought him comfort. It was also something he knew would make his mother happy, despite the fact she'd likely never know back home in Chicago. "You've cleaned the wound well," Ethan said as he examined George's torso. The burn spread from just under his navel to above his sternum, but the worst of it was on his stomach. Despite the initial ugliness, most of the burns appeared somewhat superficial. "If you'll help us pick out the dirt and soot, I've got extra tweezers for the job." Ethan clearly knew Carter had had some sort of medical training, as this wasn't the first time they'd worked side by side at the mine. Still, Ethan had never done anything beyond hinting, and Carter wasn't particularly inclined to share the tragic details of his own past. Once they'd cleaned the instruments with carbolic acid, all three of them worked together to pick each piece of potentially infecting material out of the burns, doing their best to protect the blistering skin as it began to bubble up in an attempt to protect the sensitive skin below. They'd just finished when the wind kicked up, and the faint scent of burned hair wafted from George's blisters into the air. In less than a second, Grace had gone from focused and compassionate to what his grandfather called green in the gills, hopping to her feet and covering her mouth as she pushed her way through the bevy of men gathered around. "Go," Carter said as he continued to spread more of the herbal salve Ethan had brought onto George's chest. "I'll finish the salve, and you can lay the bandages when I'm finished." Hopefully, he wouldn't overstep his bounds, though Ethan had never seemed prideful enough to mind. The doctor jumped to his feet, following Grace through the crowd of curious onlookers, each man dirtier than the last, it seemed. A hunch he hoped with everything in him wasn't true settled in his chest, but only time would tell. By the time they'd finished up with George and gotten him into Ethan's wagon to head towards town, she seemed to be feeling better. By the time they actually arrived in town, Carter and one of George's best friends riding behind to help get him inside the clinic, Grace hopped down from the wagon as though she had the energy of a schoolgirl. Once they got George settled in the clinic, Carter knew there was only so much he could do for the moment, so taking a walk down to the post office to pick up some plans he'd ordered for the new smithy seemed like a good idea. He'd come back later to check on George, but for now Ethan and Grace seemed to have things well in hand. By the time he reached the post office, he'd started to grow excited again about the lot he'd finally been able to purchase in town just beyond the livery. It wasn't a large lot, but it was more than sizable enough for the space he needed with as much work as he'd been doing for the livery in recent months. Farmers and ranchers had also taken to utilizing his services rather than going into Sawyer's Pass for tools and equipment they needed, and being in town a few days a week was bound to make business grow even more. Ronald Dawson, the short, balding man whose thin hair and beard were whiter than an early winter snow, grinned when he spotted Carter. A bead of sweat dotted his forehead despite fall's cooler temperatures. "There he is. I know you're chomping at the bit to get those plans, Carter. You do have some mail, so maybe today's your lucky day." Smithy builds were a little more complicated than regular homes or barns, as they had to have enough airflow to keep things safe while not having too much to maintain the heat of the forge. There were certain spots needing extra support due to the weight of the forge itself, and certain emergency protocols Carter wanted to put into place. Because of that, he'd sent off to a company back east who designed the spots and sold their plans for a sizable fee. It cost him more than he'd ever imagined, but he hoped it would be well worth it in the end. Ronald handed him one large envelope sporting the return address from the company he'd been hoping to see, and a grin spread over Carter's face. That was, until he saw the other, much smaller envelope from back home in Chicago. It was his sister's handwriting, and something settled heavily in his gut as he took it. Usually, his sisters Marnie and Beth would add postscripts to his mother's letters rather than writing their own. If Marnie had written on her own accord, something must be wrong. The plans forgotten for the time being, Carter quickly broke the seal on the smaller envelope and pulled it out to read. His heart beat quickly, his mind racing over what could possibly be the problem at home. "Carter. I hope you're well, but I fear you won't be after you receive this news. Grandfather has suffered a stroke, and he's not yet regained his speech or much of his movement back. Currently, he's bed-bound, and the doctors fear he'll stay this way until he has another stroke or simply passes from complications. We are all beside ourselves, as you can imagine, and it guts me to deliver such awful news with such haste, but I fear there is more at stake than simply dear grandfather's well-being. As you know, upon grandfather's death, the home, family wealth, and properties all fall to you while the stakes in the company go to Uncle Pruitt. Well, since grandfather's stroke, Uncle Pruitt has been spending more and more time here at the house, and I overheard him talking to his man this morning in the parlor. Despite still being in the middle of the post office, heart-aching due to the news of his grandfather's stroke, Carter groaned. Uncle Pruitt was a snake, his father's brother and the youngest of grandfather's sons. When Papa died in a shipwreck on his way to London when Carter was 15 and the girls were still in Bowes, grandfather had taken the business back over, sold the house he'd shared with grandmother, and moved into their brownstone manor in the heart of Chicago. It was beautiful, ornate and ostentatious yet filled with love and laughter despite the pain the family had endured. At least, until the night everything changed forever. Forcing himself out of the past and back to the page in front of him, Carter braced himself for his sister's words. Uncle Pruitt said he planned to take it all from us, even the house, despite the fact Mother, Beth Ann, and I are supposed to be able to remain here as long as we wish. I fear he will turn us out if grandfather passes, as you know the stipulation for your inheriting it. Of course he did. It was the whole reason he and Eleanor had begun courting in the first place. In order to receive his inheritance, the one he'd never wanted but needed to protect his mother and sisters, would only come available to him if he married. Otherwise, it would revert to Uncle Pruitt as he was widowed but had 2 sons by his late wife, Lorna. I know you've washed your hands of this mess, and I honestly can't blame you. You're our only hope. Please, if you've any affection left for Mother, Beth Ann, or me, help us keep our home. Marnie signed the missive in her impeccable signature swirl, the kind honed from hours of practicing with the hopes of one day having her own household's correspondence to send out. At 16, she thought of little beyond marriage and the latest fashions, but she was kind and bright. He couldn't fault her for throwing in the last bit in her desperation. The plans he'd been so focused on mostly forgotten, Carter swept up the rest of his things and waved at Ron as he moved out of the post office. What in the world was he going to do, and was there any possibility he could do it quickly enough to satisfy Uncle Pruitt? Chapter 2. Christmas Eve, 1887. Mud Lake, Colorado. Next stop, Mud Lake, Colorado, the porter shouted from the front of the passenger train. Mud Lake, Colorado. Mia straightened quickly, stretching her neck as she gazed out the window at the rapidly approaching town. This would be her new home, and Grace promised her she'd love it. At least she hadn't been exaggerating about the beauty. Pulling into the makeshift station, Mia gasped at the mountain range which seemed to stand guard around the town, the snow-covered peaks the only white to speak of for the moment. Standing, Mia took her bag from where one of the gentlemen she'd ridden beside pulled it down from the compartments above. He wore a dapper suit with fine tailoring, and he told her he was on his way to California, San Francisco, to be exact. Miss Middleton, Colin said as he released her satchel. I hope you enjoy your stay with your sister, but if you should find Mud Lake not to your liking, he produced a card from his pocket and handed it to her. Write to me in San Francisco. Someone of your talents would do well in a larger city. He eyed her dress, the one she'd not only sewn but designed as well. It was pale pink, far too light for this time of year, and far too delicate for a small town in Colorado. It was special to her and was one of her favorite creations. Some part of her wanted Grace to see it and be proud of what she'd managed to create. Thank you, Colin. It was a pleasure meeting you. The man was probably 10 years older than her 20 years of age, but he was handsome and had only been respectful on the ride from New Orleans. He smiled softly, moving to the side to allow her to pass, but she didn't miss the slight tightening in his eyes when he looked out over the town. It is a rather humble place, isn't it? It was, but it had her family here. Not just Grace, but Tessa, Kate, Mara, and Paige as well. She'd grown up with these women, all coming to the Hope House orphanage in New Orleans at different points in their childhoods. Some of them had endured unspeakable things, while others had suffered the pain of losing those closest to them. Still, others had simply been surrendered, the nuance of which she'd not understood until she was much older. Smoothing back her blonde curls, the ones framing her face the only ones she left free, Mia took a deep breath. Maybe, but I don't really stand on ceremony anyway. With that, Mia turned and made her way down the aisle, smiling at the porter as she moved down the stairs. The cool air hit her cheeks immediately, as though it breathed life into her very soul, but it was the woman standing on the other side of the platform pulling her attention. Gracie. Grace's belly had already begun to grow, as she was due with her baby in late spring. It was ultimately why Mia had come to Colorado, as she longed to be part of her niece or nephew's life. The circumstances surrounding the baby's conception had been tragic, an attack perpetrated on Grace by the vilest of men, but the utter peace and contentment on her face made it quite clear she'd settled into her new role. Grace sniffed as she pulled Mia as close as her belly would allow. "I'm so happy you're here." After what felt like 3 seconds but was probably more like a minute or two of embracing the sister she sorely missed, Mia pulled back and placed a hand atop the sensible green and white plaid dress covering Grace's middle. "Hello, sweet baby. I'm your Auntie Mia, and I can't wait to spoil you rotten." The tears she'd shed after Grace's letter informing her of the reality of the attack, as well as the blessedly welcome consequence, were abundant. Still, this baby deserved to know nothing but love and family. "How are you feeling about all this, Gracie?" "It can't be easy." "It hasn't all been roses," Grace said as she shook her head. "I'm genuinely more grateful than I can say the Lord has brought forth this miracle from such a barbaric act." The handsome blonde man beside Grace placed his hand on her back gently, and Mia realized this must be Ethan. "This is one of the main reasons why. Mia, I'd like you to meet Ethan, your brother-in-law." By the time they'd reached the clinic and Ethan had set Mia's things in the apartment, Grace looked exhausted enough to fall over where she stood. "Gracie," Mia said as she hung the last of the dresses she'd brought. "Why don't you go home and lie down? I'd like to meet my new employers, and you said the Mercantile is only a few doors down." They'd managed to secure a position for Mia at the Mercantile, helping her new employers with a whole host of things from minding their children to working in the store itself. Ethan bit his lip, clearly amused watching his wife's indecision war within her. "Mia's right, Grace. You could use a rest. Why don't you lie down back at the house? I'll take care of preparing dinner for us all." Their house was basically in the clinic's backyard, and Mia would be back before Grace woke up. "Go on, Gracie," Mia said as she stepped forward to place a hand on her sister's shoulder. "This isn't a visit. I'm home now. We'll have all the time in the world to catch up." Grace's eyes misted, but she nodded. "All right, but ask Lizzie if they have any thicker coats in stock at the Mercantile when you go. Put it on our tab, and get some boots and thick wool socks too. The sun's melted all the snow for now, but it'll be chilly tomorrow riding out to the ranch for Christmas with everyone." "I'll do that. Thank you, Gracie. Ethan, make sure she gets some rest, please." Completely confident the man who looked at her sister like she hung the very moon in the sky would take good care of her, Mia stepped back out into the chilly air and took a deep breath. It was beautiful in Colorado, the landscape, smells, and noises so different from back in New Orleans. Following the directions Ethan had given her, Mia stepped off the clinic's porch and onto the damp dirt, still quite hard from the freeze they'd apparently had the night before. She'd noticed the ice patches in the shadows on the walk over from the train station, but somehow she'd not slipped on one despite her chatting with Grace. She'd only just spotted the Mercantile sign in the distance when her luck ran out. The toe of her fashionable slipper slid across a patch of ice, and her arms flailed to keep herself upright. Oh. Before she'd managed to fall flat on her backside, a pair of strong hands caught her and placed her back on her feet. She whirled around, intent to thank the kind stranger, when she came face to face with the largest man she'd ever seen. He was tall, at least an entire foot taller than her, and his arms looked like the tree trunks dotting the forest surrounding town. How in the world had he managed to purchase a coat to fit him? Surely, it had to be custom-made. It was an odd thought, but she was a seamstress after all. The dark wool was similar in color to his close-cut curly hair, his brows knit together in concern as his hand kept contact with her arm. "Are you all right?" Of course his voice was low and calming, something of a rumble like she'd always imagined a volcano would sound like before erupting. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you. His eyes shot down to the shoes on her feet and the fashionable cream-colored coat, which had been just fine in New Orleans, but wasn't at all thick enough for the weather this far north. You're going to need some new shoes. Those slippers won't last a week here. He didn't say it in a patronizing tone, not at all like Colin had sounded on the train. More informational, albeit a little concerned. Yes, my sister and her husband have sent me to the mercantile to see what they had in stock. I've just arrived from New Orleans. Realization dawned on his face, and he nodded. His jaw stayed a little tense, as did the set of his shoulders, but nothing about him felt threatening despite his size. Ah, you're Mia Middleton, I presume? Who was this man? He was dressed like a common laborer, yet he spoke like a well-educated city man. Nothing was wrong with either of those things, but they didn't often appear together in the same package. Pleased to make your acquaintance. I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage. Finally removing his hand from her arm, an absence she missed more than she should have, the man held out that same large hand for a shake. Carter Hayes, ma'am. It's nice to meet you. As he'd suspected, the same jolt of awareness which had traveled through him the moment he caught Mia radiated again as she reached out to shake his offered hand. She was small and dainty compared to his considerable size, and downright stunning in her pale pink dress with white lace and cream-colored coat. He hadn't initially noticed the resemblance to Grace, but staring now he had no idea how he had missed it. Both women sported light blonde hair, and Mia's complexion was even fairer than her sister's. Both had rosy cheeks when flustered, but Mia's was more pink than red. Still, as pretty as she looked in the coat, it would have to go. It wouldn't keep her warm in a Colorado winter, but it sure brought out the blush in her cheeks. It's nice to meet you too, Mr. Hayes. Interesting. Her handshake was as prim as the rest of her, though a blonde curl had pulled loose from its pins during her near tumble. If possible, it only made her prettier. The most curious part about her handshake was the contrast of the feel of her hands. They were workers' hands, yet she carried herself like a society woman. Of course, if she was Grace's sister, she'd grown up at the orphanage, but what about since she left? You said you're headed to the mercantile? I am. Grace and Ethan have set me up with a position working for the owners. Their hands still clasped, Carter realized he had no desire to let go. Part nanny, part seamstress, I suppose. Ah. The hands made sense then. You'll like Paul and Lizzie. They're good people, and they'll take good care of you. Looking around, Carter spotted the way various men in town craned their necks to see Mia. They might as well have been catcalling. He narrowed his gaze at one particular miner, a man he knew to be a scoundrel of the worst sort named Jefferson, if his own bragging was to be believed. Working at the mine, he knew to take tales of the men's exploits with a grain of salt, but Jefferson Kane was one who had his instincts on alert. Listen, Mia, I don't mean to overstep my bounds, but be careful walking back and forth from the clinic. This isn't New Orleans. There's about 30 men to every one woman in this town, and those women are basically all married. How had this woman he just met stirred such protective instincts in him upon first meeting? Why did the mail-order bride summons he'd sent months ago suddenly settle in his gut like a brick? It couldn't be helped, not when Beth Ann's medical conditions meant she needed to be close to her doctor and the Chicago hospitals in the event of his grandfather's passing. The first tinge of regret pricked his mind as he stared down at the woman before him. Mia smiled softly, at least not offended by his concern. Thank you for the warning. I'm sure I'll find my bearings here quickly, but I'll be sure to stay vigilant. The smile, it would bring a man to his knees with her bright, caramel-colored eyes and single dimple on her right cheek. Had he ever seen a woman more beautiful? As the thought of his potential mail-order bride had pricked him earlier, guilt over the fact he'd never had this response to Eleanor surfaced as well. Be sure you do, and if you ever need anything, I'll be down at the site for the new smithy often. He pointed down to where they'd almost finished the structure for the opening, just past the livery for the sake of convenience. If anyone gives you any trouble, come find me. Despite his discomfort with how pretty he found her, the thought of any man so much as bothering her brought out something in him he'd rather not dwell on. Still, he managed to tamp it down as she nodded, finally pulling her hand back from their shake. I'll do that, Mr. Hayes. You have a nice day. Please, call me Carter. Mr. Hayes is my father. And his grandfather. And his uncle. But he'd not go into any of that, nor the fact his father was no longer with them. You can call me Mia. It was nice to meet you, Carter. He watched as she moved safely up the steps and into the mercantile as though she floated up the steps. Despite her earlier trip on the ice, Mia moved more gracefully than any woman he'd ever seen, her pale pink dress swishing delicately behind her. He knew he was staring, but something about Mia Middleton captured his attention and refused to let go. Could he somehow write the mail-order bride agency and ask them to tear up his summons? The errant thought came out of nowhere, bowling him over with its audacity. No, he'd just met this woman, and despite her beauty, he had no claim whatsoever on her. This wasn't Chicago where he could have had any woman he wanted, and his hopeful marriage wasn't one with the luxury of choice. No, if he wanted to save his mother and sisters, he had to marry before grandfather passed. That meant he didn't have the luxury of courting a beautiful woman, no matter how much he might want to. As the bell above the mercantile door jingled to signal she'd opened it, Mia threw a look over her shoulder, a shy smile ghosting her lips as she caught him staring. With her free hand, Mia raised her free hand in a wave. You'd better get some gloves too, he said. Wouldn't want frostbite to render you unable to sew. He hadn't meant it to come out as harshly as it had, but it was probably better anyway. She straightened, confusion and a little bit of fire flashed in her eyes. That was good. She'd need the fire this far west. Thank you for your suggestions, Mr. Hayes. Again with the Mr. Hayes. Oh well, maybe her thinking him too overbearing would solve the problem for him. As he turned to move back down the street towards the new smithy, the sky opened up, and a gentle snow began trickling down. Whether it was a positive omen or a negative one, he had no idea, but the world certainly felt a little colder than it had when he'd set out earlier. Chapter 3. Goodness, am I glad to see you, the pretty blonde woman who'd introduced herself as Lizzie said as she rounded the mercantile counter to pull Mia into a hug. It was a stark contrast to the way she'd felt a few moments before when the handsome giant of a man had kept her from falling, the way the shock of his touch seemed to radiate through her, but it was welcome nonetheless. Lizzie had a motherly embrace, one that welcomed a body to take a deep breath and let the worries of the day melt away. I'm surprised you came today, though. Paul and I had expected you to settle in for a few days at least. From what Ethan had told her, Paul and Lizzie owned the mercantile and had 2 children, Coralie and Timothy. It was all she knew for the moment, but she was eager to help the young parents out. I don't tend to like to sit around, and I knew there was no way Grace would go take a rest if I didn't make myself scarce. She winked, certain Lizzie would understand. The mercantile was laid out similarly to ones she'd seen in New Orleans. Rows of shelves with all sorts of wares took up the bulk of the floor, but a large counter with a floor-to-ceiling shelf of penny candies sat behind it. The back corner of the store appeared to hold fabrics, and Mia itched to get her hands on those. Behind the desk was an opening leading into a storeroom of sorts with a staircase leading up to the second floor adorning the back wall. Lizzie sighed knowingly. Oh, the fatigue of pregnancy. It's something, to be sure. Then, a little boy with the most adorable face and curly red hair barreled down the stairs in the back room holding a stick in one hand and a cookie in the other. It me Thien. He came towards them as a little girl in a blue dress chased him down the stairs looking all kinds of put out. Despite his highly inefficient cross between a run and a toddle, he still moved quickly as he stuffed the cookie into his mouth. He stuck his hands out behind him like a bird's wings and leaned forward, chewing the cookie despite his grin. It's mine, Cora, and you not my boss. Crumbs tumbled from his mouth as he shouted, but he managed to save the cookie itself. Lizzie sighed deeply, her hand absently moving to smooth back her long blonde hair. The braid went to her waist, but Mia had no doubt the woman had to keep it well out of her face to control these 2. Both of you, stop. They froze where they were, eyes wide as they took in their mother. The little girl spoke first. Mama, we were having a tea party, and he decided to take all the cookies Nana made before we'd even served our tea. Lizzie placed a hand on her forehead. Where's your father? Then, a red-headed man barreled down the stairs after the children, his face equal parts apologetic and amused. I'm so sorry, love. I had some tea spilled on me and went to change shirts. By the time I got back, the rest of the party had abandoned me. Unable to hold in her laughter anymore, Mia let it out just as the children and their father finally noticed her. I can see I'm in for a treat. She grinned wide, charmed by the little red-headed boy and his blonde sister. His mouth was still full of the cookie he'd stuffed in all at once, and the girl's hands were on her hips as though she'd seen her mother do it a time or two. Hi, there. My name is Mia, and I believe I'm to be a new friend for you both. Lizzie's tense shoulders relaxed. As you can see, we need you. With Paul's parents getting older, they can't watch the children as much as they used to. We're burning the candle at both ends trying to keep up with them, and soon Coralie will need to start her lessons as well. She blushed, an embarrassed shrug lifting her shoulders. We're a little behind on those. I can understand why, Mia replied. Clearly, the two of them had more on their plate than they could feasibly handle at the moment, which was where she came in. I assume you're Coralie? The girl bobbed her head up and down, curiosity winning over her frustration with her brother. Are you gonna teach me to read? I think that could be arranged. Raising an eyebrow at the child who must be Timothy, she bit her lip to keep from laughing. I suppose you're Timothy, or have you replaced him with a chipmunk? A snort of laughter burst from the little boy, as did a few more of his cookie crumbs, causing his mother to gasp. Timothy Gaines, you know better than to speak with your mouth full. She turned back to Mia, her cheeks even pinker. I promise we've taught them manners. He's at the age where he's got more energy than sense. She said it with frustration, but also with a deep love for the little boy who moved slowly to wrap his arms around her legs. Sorry, Mama, he said through the same cookie he'd yet to swallow. Her anger clearly deflating, Lizzie leaned down to pick the boy up. Can you at least swallow your cookie, son? Then, you can introduce yourself to Miss Mia properly. As he did so, Lizzie addressed Mia again. Coralie is my little princess. She loves tea parties and animals and loves to have books read to her. Timothy has more energy than he knows what to do with, and he'd spend all day in the summer down at the lake catching frogs if we'd let him. The affection in her tone was clear despite the exasperation, and Mia was grateful for the chance to help. Mia chuckled, excited for her new post. All of those things sound just perfect for children their age. I don't know about the frogs in this weather, Timothy, but I imagine we can find plenty of things to keep your interest. Coralie, I've thrown more than a few tea parties in my day, so I think we'll get along just fine. Coralie giggled and moved the rest of the way into the mercantile's main space. Your dress is pretty. Pink is my favorite color. Thank you. I made it myself. Removing her coat, Mia did a quick twirl, earning herself a giggle from the girl. Twirling around in a favorite dress was something she'd never really grown out of, and this one swished more than others. It was impractical, sure, but pink had always been one of Mia's favorites too. It worked well with her complexion, and the lace softened the look even more. I'm partial to pink, myself. You made that? Lizzie studied the intricate work of the dress as she could see with Mia's coat. This is beautiful. You're very talented. Grace told me you could sew. I figured we'd put you on a couple of mending projects, but this is art. Before she could respond, the bell above the door jingled. And a tall cowboy moved through it. He had dark hair and tanned skin, his Stetson dotted with snow. Mia now noticed falling softly outside. I'm so glad y'all are still open today. Kate realized she was running low on a few things before we have everyone out for Christmas tomorrow, and she's entirely too pregnant for me to argue with at this point. The red-headed man barked a laugh before moving forward to help the cowboy. Say no more. Samuel, this is Mia Middleton, Grace's sister. She's just moved to town, and she'll be helping us out with the children for a few hours a week. Mia, this is Samuel Pratt. I don't believe I've introduced myself yet either. Paul Gaines. He put his hand out for a shake as Samuel dipped his head in a respectful greeting. We're mighty happy you're here. Mia stayed for a few minutes to get to know the family a bit better before purchasing her new coat and boots. The snow had actually begun to fall a little harder now, but it was such a novel sight for her she couldn't help but venture forward as she exited the mercantile and moved down the street. An axe, and a felled tree she hadn't noticed before stood behind him. He'd shed his heavy coat, and the sleeves of his wool shirt were rolled up to his elbows. The move exposed his muscular forearms, but his jaw sat tight as he held narrowed eyes on her. This man's audacity was something. Normally, she didn't have the fire of some of the other women who came from Hope House, but he seemed to bring it out. I told you I appreciate your concern, but I can take care of myself. I don't even know you, Mr. Hayes, and yet you seem preoccupied with my safety and comfort. Raising a brow in challenge, Mia felt the tiniest twinge of remorse when his massive shoulders seemed to sag. You're right, and I'm sorry. You barely know me. He shoved his hands in his pockets, hesitating there for a moment. I have 2 sisters, and if one of them was out walking in the woods by herself in a mining town with so many lonely men, I'd want someone to keep an eye on her. For some reason, Mia believed him. He didn't seem like a man with ill intentions, but genuinely wanted to ensure she was safe. Gesturing around the clearing with the town still plainly in sight, Mia raised a brow. This is hardly the woods, Carter, but if you'd like to walk me back to the clinic you're welcome to do so. His whole body seemed to sag in relief. I'd be honored, ma'am. Let me grab my coat, and we'll head that way. He placed his axe in the tree he'd cut and pulled his coat from a tree branch before jogging back to her. So, she said as they began moving towards town. Are you building a house? Soon, but right now I'm putting the finishing touches on the new smithy. He kept a polite distance from her, gesturing to the large, dark wooden building beyond the livery. I've been the only smithy in town for a while, but I've mostly stayed down at the mine. I'll be splitting time back and forth, and this location is more convenient for the ranchers. Interesting. Was that the only reason you opted for the new location? It seems like it will be far less convenient for you. Going back and forth was bound to waste valuable time if he'd had a serviceable spot before. At first, he replied with a shrug. I'll have more freedom to do some of the pieces I've been wanting to do in town, whereas at the mine it seems there's always one thing after another. A cool breeze picked up, and Mia pulled her coat tighter around her. The snow came faster too, dancing across the ground in front of her as it fell. What kind of pieces? Hesitating for only a moment, cleared his throat. More artistic pieces, I suppose. I sketch things when I have the time, and I'd like to try my hand at them to send back east. No one would have a purpose for them out here. It's probably silly anyway, but I enjoy it. Mia understood better than most people. Sometimes, the creator needs to create something beautiful. That can be a purpose all in itself. Turning to face her, Carter stopped and cocked his head to the side. I don't think I've ever heard it put that way. Are you some type of artist yourself? A seamstress with dreams of designing dresses, she replied with a shrug as they resumed walking. I've got my own sketchbook of highly impractical items which exist purely for the sake of beauty. A smile spread across her face as she thought of all the ways this new landscape would inspire her with fabrics, colors, and styles. She sighed. I came to believe a while back that God creates, and we are created in His image. Therefore, it makes sense we would create too. He didn't speak for a moment, and she wondered where this mountain of a man before her stood with the Almighty. As they reached the clinic steps, he stopped at the bottom. Thank you for letting me walk you back, Mia. I know I don't have a right to ask you to be careful, but anyway, have a good evening. Before she could respond, Carter turned and moved back down the street from the direction they came. What a confusing man, unlike any she'd ever met before. Thoughts of how much she still had left to unpack whirling around in her head, Mia entered the clinic, already closed for the day. She didn't have time to dwell on the blacksmith who seemed in one breath like an overprotective busybody who couldn't imagine a woman might take care of herself, only to turn around in the next and reveal the heart of an artist. The day after Christmas, Carter let his head fall back against the wall at the mine's smithy as his head began to pound. He clutched the letter before him, the one he'd picked up from Ron earlier in the day. Marnie had written again, this time to inform him Uncle Pruitt had proposed marriage to their mother in the event grandfather passed. Apparently, his health had gotten slowly but progressively worse over the 2 months since she'd written, and the doctors thought it would only be a matter of time until he passed. It could be weeks, it could be months, but it was imminent. He'd scribbled a quick reply there in the post office, wishing there was a way Mother and his sisters could come here. Unfortunately, he knew they could never move here due to his sister Beth Ann's chronic asthma. It was managed well enough in the city, and the doctors who specialized in her condition were in Chicago. There was burgeoning research that the crisp mountain air might actually do far better for her lungs than in Chicago. If nothing else, it only confirmed he'd been right to send to the mail-order bride agency in New Orleans. The rest of the morning was spent in a flurry of activity at the mine while his head continued pounding as he grasped at any other options available to him. Getting married was the only way to receive his inheritance, that much he'd known for years. After Eleanor had died, he'd not planned to ever claim it, instead imploring grandfather to change the will and allow everything to go to his sisters. Uncle Pruitt could have the business, none of it had ever interested Carter, but the home his sisters had grown up in should remain theirs without his mother having to marry a man who'd no doubt be unfaithful to her. The man was a scoundrel, and one with a quick temper too. Grandfather had always been blind to his youngest son's misdeeds, but father hadn't been. He'd always known what kind of a man Uncle Pruitt was, and he'd worked hard to keep his family away from him. That afternoon, as he made the short ride into town to work some more at the town smithy, he was surprised to find Samuel Pratt, his foreman, Riley, and his wrangler, Joshua, leaning against the buildings. Samuel and Joshua wore Stetsons, while Riley's head was bare. All three wore the typical thick leather coats and gloves that spoke of the long days they spent on the range. For the moment, at least, he could put aside his worries and focus on some of his best customers. "Hi there, gentlemen. How can I help you today?" Samuel stuck a hand in his pocket and pulled out a list scribbled on a sheet of paper. "Got some tools we need for the ranch before spring starts. We figured you might be able to get a jump on them. Joshua needs a few tools to make shoeing the horses easier. He thought you might be able to work something out." Joshua, the blonde-haired wrangler with a newly grown beard and typically cheeky expression, grinned. "That's right. I can't draw to save my life, but I thought we might work together to figure it out. I was in Tulsa a few weeks ago meeting with some other wranglers, and the farriers there had a couple of things that would make my job a whole lot easier." "Long as it's not too easy," Samuel said with a smirk. "Then, what would I pay you for?" "Hey, I nearly lost my leg for the sake of the Pratt Ranch," Joshua laughed. "I'd say I've earned my pay." He gestured down to his now healed leg, the one which had been the unintentional job interview for Grace's nursing skills when she'd arrived in town. Ethan had shared how deeply she'd impressed him, and Carter had been able to tell even then his friend was a goner over the woman. "That's a little dramatic," Riley said. "Dr. Collins and Grace had you fixed up and back on your feet in less than a week. Plus, it was your own fault you got distracted and lodged the pickaxe in your shin in the first place." The good-natured ribbing was clearly a common occurrence with the men from the Pratt Ranch, and Carter always found it amusing. "I think I can probably help you with the tools. Anything else on the list?" "Yes," Samuel said as he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "It's not for the ranch. Last time we went to Denver, Kate saw this wrought iron gate with flowers and vines and things forged into it." He removed his Stetson, twisting the brim in his hands. I don't really know how to describe it, but she looked at it for the longest time. Her birthday's coming up, and I wondered if you might be able to make something similar for her." The clear discomfort on the cowboy's face was almost enough for Carter to join in the ribbing himself, but he didn't want to spook Samuel and lose the opportunity to create one of the more artistic pieces he'd been wanting to do for ages. Mia's words echoed in his head again. "Sometimes, the creator just needs to create something beautiful. That can be a purpose in itself. Then you've come to the right place. Y'all come on in with me, and I'll get out my sketch pad. The forge is all set up now, and I'll be officially opening next week. As long as you're willing to give me some time to do the custom pieces, I'm sure we can get it all ironed out." Chapter 4. "Miss Mia," Corley said as she ran the length of the field between the clinic and Grace's home. "Miss Mia, look what I found." She held out a stone, so perfectly smooth it shone in the mid-January afternoon light. It was only a little darker than the snow, so I almost didn't see it. The 6-year-old's cheeks were flushed with excitement, her breaths quick. Timothy looked up from where he and Mia had been fashioning the perfect snow fort, apparently deciding the rock wasn't quite exciting enough for him to abandon his post. "That's beautiful, Coralie," Mia said as the girl beamed. "I can't wait until this spring when the wildflowers come up. Your mother has told me they're absolutely beautiful, and I want to teach you how to press flowers into books so you can keep them forever if you'd like." It was something she'd gotten into the habit of doing as a girl, and growing older had given her more skills in drying flowers in such a way they retained most of their vibrant colors. "I think you should keep this rock. It seems like a very special one." It had been 3 weeks since Christmas, and Mia had finally begun to settle into her routine of helping on occasion in the clinic while mostly working for Paul and Lizzie watching the children. Coralie and Timothy were a handful, but they were also incredibly bright children with a healthy curiosity for the world around them. As long as they spent a few hours in the sunshine every day, they were more easily corralled into whatever it is they were supposed to be doing. "It's probably time to head back," Mia said after a few more minutes. "Your mother said for you two to be home by lunchtime, and I don't want to keep her waiting." Usually, Mia only watched the children in the mornings when Lizzie and Paul were both needed at the mercantile. In the afternoon, she either spent time at the clinic, exploring her new home, or even taking a short nap if the children had been particularly energetic that morning. Timothy's stomach growled in answer, and his bright red curls fell forward as he giggled. "Timmy is hungry." He giggled again, poking his belly with his gloved hands. Despite her earlier frustration with her little brother over his lack of desire to go searching for fairy houses, Coralie doubled over in a fit of her own giggles. "Then I guess we'd better head home, Miss Mia." Taking both their small hands, Mia led them back through the alleyway beside the clinic and took in the sight before her. Carter Hayes stood speaking with one of the livery employees she hadn't met yet, and both men raised their hand in greeting. Why did the sight of him cause her heart to flutter so? She'd barely even spoken to him save for the occasional greeting in town. He hadn't shown up at church since she'd come to town, but then again, they'd only met for 2 Sundays since Christmas. There always seemed to be some flurry of activity going on down the street at his new place of business. Carter bid goodbye to the livery employee and jogged across the snowy road to them. "Be careful," she called as he approached. "Wouldn't want to slip on the ice, would you?" Clearly remembering the moment they'd met, Carter smirked. "No, as I doubt there are many folks in this town who could catch me." He chuckled before leaning down to address the children. "Are you two having fun with Miss Mia today?" "We built a fort," Timothy exclaimed as he jumped up and down before sobering significantly. "We couldn't fight, though." The two of them had been bound and determined to have a snowball fight, but Mia had squashed that idea quickly after they'd voiced it. "Timmy, last time I let you two have a snowball fight, you nearly took your sister's eye out with a particularly hard one." Grinning, Mia allowed Coralie to confirm her statement with an emphatic nod. "It's much better if we play in the snow without combat." Timothy shrugged as Carter straightened again to his full height. Somehow, despite his size, he still didn't look intimidating. Clearly, the children knew him well enough to speak with him, though they weren't typically given to shyness. "I'd say that's a good idea, then." Turning his attention to Mia, Carter suddenly looked a little nervous. "What time do you finish work today?" "I'm actually done as soon as I drop these little hooligans off," Mia replied as she ruffled Timothy's hair. "Why?" Carter bit his lip, his cheeks a little more flushed than they'd been a moment before. "Meet me outside the mercantile when you're finished. I've got something I'd like to show you." By the time she'd gotten Coralie and Timothy settled with their mother for lunch, Mia wondered what in the world had possessed her to say yes. Ethan and Grace didn't worry nearly as much about her whereabouts as Carter seemed to that day in the clearing. She had this innate instinct she could trust him, but what could he want to show her? Birds flapped in her belly as she stepped out onto the snow-covered porch in front of the mercantile. Carter stood at the bottom of the steps, both hands in his pockets and his hat pulled low over his ears. His toes formed circles in the snow under his boots, his brown eyes a little uncertain as he looked up and spotted her. "Are you ready?" "I am." "Are you going to end the suspense and tell me what you're showing me, or am I going to have to guess?" At that, he grinned, and a tiny bit of the tension began to break as they set off down the street in the direction of the smithy. I think I'd like to hear you guess. Well, I don't think you're planning to kidnap me and hold me for ransom, so I suppose that leaves a traveling circus troupe in the mountains? His brows furrowed as he stared at her, equal parts amusement and confusion dancing in his expression. You know, at first you come across like a genteel southern belle, but that's not who you are at all, is it? Barking out a wholly unladylike laugh, Mia shook her head. I can and have blended in among society when I worked for them designing their clothing, but I grew up in the same orphanages as Grace, so my sensibilities aren't that delicate. He sobered, gesturing to the left as they moved down a path leading to the woods. It may not be appropriate to ask, so feel free to tell me so, but what happened to your parents? I don't mind. I don't actually remember my parents. As a child, the idea of her parents and the life they might have lived had plagued her, but that was before she knew the truth. We were left on the front steps of an orphanage when I was only a few weeks old and Grace was a toddler. That group home wasn't the best situation for us. Her earliest memories had been crying in a corner, soiled and hungry, while the house parents spent the money the state gave them on alcohol and gambling. If it hadn't been for Grace sneaking food for them at night, she wasn't sure how they'd have fared. Carter made a noise low in his throat, almost like a growl. I hate thinking any children end up in places like that. I'm sorry. The Lord delivered us, though. He brought us to Hope House when I was maybe 8, and it's been home since then. The part of their story of the Children's Aid Society coming to the group home and dispersing the poorly treated children to different, better orphanages was something she'd forever thank God for. Carter scoffed as the path led them into the woods, though the road ahead of them was clearly well traveled by foot. If he was looking out for you, why did he allow a baby and a toddler to endure such things in the first place? It was a question she'd heard before, but never had she heard it laced with the same pain and frustration as there was in his particularly low voice. Carter had been through the fire, but he'd been burned badly. Compassion stole over her as she asked the Lord to give her the words to speak. Sin brings consequences. God didn't leave me on the steps of the orphanage, our parents did. They created the broken situation the Lord later redeemed using Hope House. I don't know why he allows children to reap the consequences of others' actions, but I know he never left us alone in either home, just like he didn't leave Grace when she was attacked in New Orleans. The news of Grace's attack had brought Mia to her knees, as did the reveal via letter of all it truly entailed once she was safely in Mud Lake. She'd cried out to God and asked him why he'd allowed a baby to be born from such brutality, but seeing Grace with Ethan, the utter peace washing over her as she cradled her growing baby bump, it was all more redemptive than she'd ever imagined. Sin has consequences. Sometimes for ourselves, and sometimes for others. But that baby in Grace's belly? Her relationship with Ethan? Our coming to Hope House and being raised to know and love our Heavenly Father in the absence of an earthly one? That's the redemption the world needs, and it brings me peace I'll never be able to fully explain. For the second time since he'd met her, Mia's words swirled in Carter's head. How long had it been since he'd truly experienced any peace? Had he ever? He'd grown up with the faith of his parents, but after Eleanor died, it had all slipped through his fingers like grains of sand on the beach. They moved through the woods at a leisurely pace, Carter stopping any time he needed to step over a felled tree or hop a particularly icy spot to offer Mia his hand. If she'd noticed his silence, she'd not felt a need to address it. Almost there, he said as the mountains surrounding the lake came into view. There she is. In front of them stood Mud Lake, frozen solid in the cold air but still breathtakingly beautiful in its blue sheen. Somehow, it still looked like water despite the fact if one was to step on it, it would hold their weight. Pine trees and other evergreens darkened the landscape around it that was otherwise covered in snow, dotting the mountains as well as the hills rising up from its banks on three sides. Mia gasped, emerging from the woods with a look of awe on her face. It's beautiful. This is Mud Lake, Carter explained softly. It was originally supposed to be called Crystal Lake, but the original settler who'd gone to settle the town's name didn't want the place to grow too crowded. He changed it once he got there, and it's been the name ever since. Stifling a slight giggle, pinking up her pretty fair skin even more, Mia grinned. I love that story. She moved towards the bank of the river, her dark green dress contrasting the snow save for the lace adorning the skirt. Her thick coat was simple, but he had no doubt she'd make herself another one with more embellishments before the next winter. Thank you for showing this to me. Honestly, he didn't know the reason for the draw he felt for Mia, and opposing sides warred within him as he approached her there at the bank. You said you appreciate beauty, and it seemed a crime you had to wait until spring to see this place. People avoid it in the winter, but I think it's just as beautiful then. Mia looked up at him, questions swirling in her eyes. Her thick fur muff matched her hat, warming her hands and ears but only serving to make her look even daintier under the layers. You have the heart of an artist, Carter Hayes, but my sister says you have the mind of a scientist, perhaps even a physician. How many more pieces am I going to discover to the puzzle of your life? How in the world could he answer? He had been a physician, but it felt like a lifetime ago. It had been obvious to both Ethan and Grace he had more medical training than a run-of-the-mill blacksmith. It wasn't until Grace outright asked him about it when they'd had to join forces to fight the smallpox outbreak in the fall that he'd admitted to his degree. Some pieces are better left in the box, he replied. You appreciate beauty, but there are parts of me which are anything but. Mia chuckled, surprising him so much he turned his whole body to face her. Why do you think things have to be perfect to be beautiful? Why do they have to be beautiful to have value? The Bible says the Lord brings beauty from ashes, but I get the feeling you're not all that interested in what Scripture has to say. Am I wrong? She raised a brow, challenging him with her gaze as he stared down into her lovely caramel-colored eyes. You're not wrong. Why was his voice so rough? I once did, but not anymore. They stared at each other for a moment, the jolt of awareness he'd felt since the first time he met her passing between them. It could have been seconds or hours they stood, surrounded by the snow-covered mountains and frozen lake. In reality, it was probably less than a minute, but the way his entire being seemed to call to her felt both terrifying and like a taste of home. Finally, she nodded and shifted her body to face the lake once again. Her countenance brightened, but it seemed a little forced. Since you're my first official friend in Mud Lake, and you've decreed my need for a protector when I go exploring, I've deemed you my tour guide. I want to see it all. This place is entirely different from any place I've ever known, and I want to experience every nook and cranny of it. Think you're up to the challenge? Her boldness surprised him once again, such a contrast to the reserved young woman with high-fashion clothing and unmatched beauty he'd first met. There was also no mistaking the clear boundary she'd put in place as soon as he'd been honest about his faith. Friends, nothing more. Good, as he still had every reason to believe he might receive a letter announcing the impending arrival of a bride any day. The thought sobered him, not nearly as appealing as it had been before Mia arrived, but it had never been about his wants and desires anyway. This was for his mother and sisters, and a mail-order bride was the quickest way to gain his inheritance to keep it from falling into the hands of Uncle Pruitt before grandfather died. In the meantime, he could enjoy a friendship with Mia, but that was all. Smirking, he dipped his head down and removed his own fur cap as though it was a Stetson. It'd be my pleasure, ma'am. Chapter 5. Carter, Mia gasped as she gently ran her fingers across the cast iron roses he'd begun fashioning for Kate Pratt. This is gorgeous. The detail, somehow both simple and intricate, settled in her heart as she studied them. Even in the low lighting of the smithy, Carter's blush still pinked his olive-skinned cheeks. I'm not completely happy with the design yet, but I'll get there. I wanted to make sure I could do it before I presented the sketch to Samuel. It had been a few weeks since he'd taken Mia down to the lake, but since then they'd traipsed all over town and the surrounding areas. He'd taught her how to identify tracks for different animals, at least the basics, as well as what to do if she ever encountered predators in the wild. She certainly wasn't going to be giving any wilderness women a run for their money, but she'd begun to grow more confident in her place among the beauty of wild Colorado. I know Kate's going to love this. The design was breathtaking, the layering and details on the rose petals something she could never have guessed was possible. What else have you got bouncing around in that head of yours? The corner of her lip quirked up, and she knew she'd hit the target when he grinned further. Of course he had a whole sketchbook of designs he'd like to bring to life, the same way she did with her dresses. The outfit she wore that morning looked like a simple calico skirt and shirtwaist at first glance, but looking closer would show ruching and detailing along the skirt that elevated the look when she didn't wear her coat. Carter pulled a sketch pad out of a basket near the window with a shrug. I don't know why I even do these sketches. It's not like I'll get a chance to create most of them. He ran a hand down his face, frustration clear before he shook it off. I guess it doesn't really matter. Oh, she gasped as she flipped through the pages. It most certainly does. Every page held a piece more intricate and beautiful than the last. There were practical items such as cast iron pans and ladles, initially straightforward but elevated with complicated braiding on the handles, as well as more decorative items like Kate's gate. I knew you were an artist, but these are something really special. It was a funny thing, showing your art to someone who could either praise it or tear it apart. Worse, they might leave you unsure of how they felt about it, something that never ceased to have her stewing over the encounter for weeks. Since she'd arrived in town, Lizzie had noticed her dresses almost every day she worked, and she'd asked if Mia would be interested in creating a few pre-made pieces for the store. There wouldn't be too much demand. But word of the small mining town with a misleading name had gotten around, and folks were moving in faster than they had in previous years. I enjoy it, he said with his hands shoved in his pockets. Discomfort on this normally confident man amused her, as it was clear he cared very much what she thought of the drawings. You should send off a few sample pieces and some sketch ideas back east to some catalogs. I bet you'd see custom orders flying off the shelves. A flash of something crossed over his face as soon as she mentioned back east, but she let it go. Either way, this does matter. Art and beauty matter because they're reflections of the God who created us. He didn't agree, that much Mia knew by now, but it didn't stop her from sharing the truth. We were created with a desire to create for a reason. I have to believe the manifestation of that desire matters. She ran a hand down the delicate details of her skirt. Some might think what I do is silly and vapid, but I disagree. It had taken years and a great deal of prayer for her to come to the conclusion, but her designs became offerings of worship to the God who gave her the talent to do so. She followed the command to do everything for his glory, working as though he was right there in the room with her. Of course it's not silly, Carter said quickly. All his discomfort was gone at his vehement defense of her craft. It's incredible what you can create from a few pieces of fabric and some thread. How did he not see his own work was much the same? Exactly. So, I know you've got a bunch of things you've been working on for the mine up here, but I want the full tour. Show me the forge. Over the next hour, Mia was fascinated to learn about the process of blacksmithing and how Carter took the raw materials, melted them down, shaped them, and brought a piece to life. He could also repair pieces when they needed it, rendering a tool a lifetime item so long as a blacksmith was around to help. That part was far different than the clothes she made. They'd get worn out at some point, and no amount of repairing and stitching could keep the fabric from one day giving up. Still, it didn't dissuade her. If anything, it only made her want to create more pieces so some of them might last as long as possible. You've inspired me. As they finished their tour and he swung the heavy doors open to step out into the late January sunshine despite the clouds, ideas swirled in her head. Inspired you to do what? Take up blacksmithing? He chuckled, the low sound sending yet another frustratingly strong jolt of awareness down her spine, a jolt she had no business feeling for a man whose faith was as tattered as Carter's. Not quite, but your sketches did give me some ideas to embroider onto a few skirts for the mercantile. They may not sell, as it's not exactly practical here, but that's all right. Carter fell into step beside her as he walked her across the street for her shift with Coralie and Timothy. They'd been firmly in the middle of a sledding competition the day before when Lizzie had called them in for dinner, something the soreness in Mia's legs and arms wouldn't let her forget. How do you do that? The way you grew up, I'd have thought you'd be practical to the point of fault, but you're not. I'm choosing to take that as a compliment, Mr. Hayes, she said with a cheeky grin. Delusional optimism, my friend. It's a constant companion of mine, and I have no plan of stopping anytime soon. On the way out to the Pratt Ranch later that week, Carter still couldn't get all the things Mia had said about creating out of his mind. It was funny. Despite the fact he'd continued attending church in Mud Lake when he could make it in, nothing in a long time had stirred his heart the way a few conversations with this little slip of a blonde from New Orleans could. It hadn't snowed in a few days, and the sun had begun the process of melting what snow already existed on the dirt road. Carter had opted to take the wagon to carry his supplies rather than tacking up a horse to ride out. The wagon wasn't always an option, but it worked well enough to make the short jaunt out. If there was more snow, the livery had a couple of sleighs he could rent in a pinch. The creek had frozen at points during the winter, and it would likely freeze again. For the moment the water flowed, the sound of the softly flowing water trickling beside him. Evergreens dotted the mountains as they gently sloped upwards on either side of the road, and once icy branches dripped water in the bright sun. Approaching the ranch, it was easy to see why Samuel loved a place like this. He'd only been out once before to help Riley and Samuel rebuild their barn after a fire had taken it down, but it hadn't been winter then. Horses frolicked in the field despite the chill, and cows grouped together in one of the pastures surrounding what looked to be large bales of hay. The fence in front of the white farmhouse was wooden and well constructed, clearly there to keep wildlife of all forms out of the large garden Kate kept in the back. Not to mention, their oldest child would likely run free in the yard through the warmer months, while Kate sat on the porch with her baby and watched. It was a good life, likely the reason for the peace he'd always noticed in Samuel's expression despite his often furrowed brow when a perceived threat was near. He loved his family, that much was plain as day. The man in question rode up from the pasture and swung down off his mount when he reached the barn. "Carter," he called with a wave. "Glad you could make it out." They'd discussed his visit at church on Sunday, though there was always the chance something could come up at the mine and delay him. "Happy to be here. It's a nice change of pace than in town, and far prettier than the mine." "That's the truth," Samuel chuckled. "I don't know how you boys spend your days underground. I'd go absolutely off my rocker if I couldn't see the sky." Placing his hands on his hips, Samuel glanced around at the land he'd clearly worked hard to cultivate, the land of his father and grandfather before him. Healthy pride for the work they'd done rolled off him in waves. "I don't spend much time underground, but it's more than enough for me." Pulling his sketchbook from under the wagon's bench seat, he flipped open to the page with his gate design. "Tell me what you think about this, and then we can take a look at the spot for my measurements." Samuel whistled, and Carter felt himself grin. "This is incredible, Hayes. You can do this?" "Yep. I've actually got a couple of styles for the flowers if you'd like to see them." He dropped his voice, eyes darting towards the house. "Kate's not outside, is she?" "She's actually over at Paige and Riley's right now," Samuel replied. "We're starting to find our routine with the baby, but she isn't all that interested in sleeping for the time being. Kate says staying in the house all day just makes it worse, so they do their best to get out and about around the ranch when they can." Carter hadn't been around babies much outside of his career as a physician, and even then it had only been long enough to get them healthy again before turning them back over to their parents. Hopefully, it'll get better soon. They talked about the design a little more, and Samuel chose which of the flowers he'd like to use for the gate before suggesting they move into the barn to talk to Joshua about a few tools he needed for the horses. As they approached, they found the cowboy in the corral, coaxing a particularly skittish chestnut towards him with a carrot. "That's it, girl," Joshua cooed softly. "You can trust me. I promise I won't hurt you." When Samuel stopped about 10 yards back from the corral, Carter did too. "This is Phoenix, a new mare who recently came to live on the farm. At the cattle drive this fall, we saw her owner treating her awful, and I had to hold Joshua back to keep him from giving the man a similar treatment." Scars crisscrossed the mare's back and legs, the tension radiating off her entire being. "Goodness, how'd you get hold of her?" "Joshua convinced the owner to sell her, or so he says." Samuel clenched his teeth, shoving his hands in his pockets. "I didn't ask too many questions, to be honest. Somehow, he got her bonded to one of our other mares, and she came with us back to the ranch. As long as Millie was right beside her, she'd follow us just about anywhere. I'm afraid she's ruined for ever being useful around here." He shook his head, his worn Stetson shifting back and forth. "He'll keep working with her. Joshua's good with the wounded ones. He makes them feel safe again. The boy can work miracles." His patience was something, that was for sure. They watched him for a few more minutes before the wrangler finished his session and led a second, gray and spotted mare out of the barn. "That must be Millie," he said as the terrified one seemed to take a deep breath. "You said they were bonded?" "Yep," Joshua replied as he hopped the fence. "They're a good pair, those two. Horses are herd animals, so having a friend for them is sometimes the best thing you can do for them. They'll bond with goats or even dogs, sometimes, but Millie and Phoenix are special." "Phoenix," Carter said. "As in rising from the ashes?" His own situation came back to him, the hope somehow this mess with his grandfather and Uncle Pruitt could work out before he had to marry a woman he'd never met. Disappointment flared within him, and it was Mia's face flashing in his mind. Should he send another letter to the bridal agency? No, he couldn't. He had to marry, and if his sister's latest letter was any indication, he had to do it soon. Mia deserved to be slowly courted and cherished for the rose she was, not scooped up into a marriage of convenience simply because he had family issues back home. "The very same," Joshua replied. "I'll be honest, I may have met my match with this one." He sighed, his breath fogging the air as he stared at Phoenix and Millie in the corral. The wrangler was tall and strong, though not as large as Carter. His build was leaner, more like Riley's than the Pratt brothers, though he was at least 3 inches over 6 feet. Carter had no doubt his frame lent itself well to hopping off a bucking horse in the event he pushed one too far. "She's just so scared of me." The heartbreak in his voice was clear, but it was Samuel who clapped a hand on the man's back. "She's not scared of you, Josh. She's scared of the man who did this to her, and she needs you to keep proving you're not him. This isn't the first time you've earned one's trust, and it won't be the last." With a nod, Joshua took another deep breath. "Trusting the Lord with my own life is a whole lot easier than trusting him with theirs, isn't it?" It was then Carter realized the horses were something like children to the man before him, not equal with humans necessarily, but the care and love he poured into them as a single man was probably the closest thing he could imagine. Still, trusting the Lord with anything in a long time had been tough for Carter. More often than not, he had to wonder if the deity was real, and if he was, did he care at all about them? Watching the horse, the memory of Eleanor's fall and his failure to save her forever carved in the stone of his memory, Carter shrugged his shoulders. "From what I hear, you're the best there is. Now, let me show you some sketches for these tools you're imagining." Chapter 6. Sissy Stinky. Samuel and Kate's son, Elijah, raced around the house at dinner a few weeks later, screaming to anyone who would listen that his baby sister, Hannah, had soiled her diaper. Sissy Stinky. He couldn't be older than 3, maybe even 2, but it was hard to tell since his build took after his father. It was nearing March, the signal of springtime in New Orleans, but the dead of winter in Colorado. Still, the Pratt Ranch house was cozy and warm despite the continued frosty air falling over them every night. "Elijah Pratt," Kate scolded as she handed Hannah to Samuel to get the girl cleaned up. "You stop right this instant." He came to a sliding stop in front of her, his dark hair and big brown eyes absolutely adorable as he stared up at his mother's stern face. "I sorry, Mama." His lower lip trembled, and Kate's eyes narrowed at her son. "I can never tell if he's manipulating me or not at this age," Kate said as she pulled Elijah close into a hug. She didn't speak to anyone in particular, though the kitchen was full of folks amused at his antics. "You know better, Elijah. I need you to apologize to our guests." With an adorably mischievous grin, Elijah turned in his mother's arms to face the group. "I sorry." With that, he took off running into the living room to play with his cousins, and the noise kicked up again. Kate flopped down into the chair next to Samuel's vacant one and wiped her brow. 3 is going to be the death of me. I can guarantee it." That answered his first question. "He speaks so well," Mia said as she finished off her last bite of pie. "Most of the children at the orphanage don't speak so clearly until they're much older." Both sets of Pratts sat at the table, as well as Riley, Paige, and surprisingly Carter. Ethan and Grace had come long enough to drop Mia off. As they'd started inside, someone in town had needed emergency medical attention and they'd hightailed it back in the other direction. Samuel had told them he'd be happy to take Mia home, as Liam and Mara were the only ones there who lived in town, and they were planning to spend the night. Although Carter lived in town as well, things had been a little awkward between them in the last week or so. He had a tendency to do that. He'd be warm and friendly to her for a while only to appear to be distancing himself. The hot and cold of how he acted towards her was confusing, but it was his issue. She'd not take it on herself, especially knowing what she did about the current state of his faith. Kate smiled at her son, a little exasperated by his antics, but still very much loving. He's going to give me plenty of gray hair, but I'm so thankful to be his mother. Due to their ages, Kate and Mia hadn't crossed paths often at Hope House. Kate moved out right around the time Mia made the transition from the children's wing to the adolescent one, which was occupied by the older girls on one hall and the older boys on another. Still, she'd always been kind and loving towards the children there, and she'd read Mia more than a few books in her time there. Mia, Mara said as she settled into her husband's side. I want to hear more about these beautiful dresses Lizzie tells me you're whipping up for the mercantile. I remembered Grace said you sewed, but I don't think I realized how talented you are with design. According to Lizzie, she's amazing, Kate answered. Tell them about the new fabrics you ordered from Dallas. Over the next few minutes, Mia did exactly as asked. The women hung on her every word as she described some ideas she had regarding designs and plans to expand the offering of ready-made clothing the mercantile boasted. Even the men seemed to care more than she'd have thought, with Samuel, Liam, Riley, and Carter listening intently to everything she said. In fact, it was Riley who spoke up next. Where did you learn to do all this? Was it something with Hope House, or did you pick it up on your own? One of the house mothers taught me the basics, but I began apprenticing with a seamstress in town when I was 15. She worked out of a fancy dress shop, and between her and a few other women there, we created custom pieces for the elite of New Orleans. It had been exciting, especially the opportunity to work with such fine fabrics, but all that glittered wasn't necessarily gold. Paige, Riley's wife, spoke then. I know you wanted to be here with Grace and the baby, but I can't imagine what it took for you to leave everything you'd accomplished back home to come to Mud Lake, Colorado. We're so glad you did, she hurried to add. I know it was difficult. It wasn't as hard as you might think, Mia replied. I realized after a few years working there it was the creativity in the ready-made pieces, not so much the custom work, which fulfilled me. Some of the dressmakers at the shop love bringing someone else's vision to life, but I enjoyed the designing process more when there weren't so many stipulations. She shrugged. Plus, some of the women could be pretty snobbish and demanding at times. It's not a dynamic I was used to, and I wasn't as comfortable in it as I'd once thought. The day a woman made her tear out perfectly pristine stitches to restitch a dress hem with her presence simply to prove she had the power had been the last straw, and it happened to coincide with the day she received yet another letter from her sister begging her to come to Colorado. She'd handed in her resignation the same day, happy to work in a service position but unwilling to be treated like she had no value. Carter watched her, and her awareness of his scrutiny had her skin feeling too tight for her body. Is that your plan, then? It was the first time he'd spoken unprompted through the whole meal, but it didn't really surprise her. Can you be happy in a town like this one designing dresses that'll likely only be worn to gather eggs and go to church on Sundays? His words might come across as critical to the others, as was evidenced by Samuel's raised brow, but Mia knew the root. He wondered the same about himself, even if he'd never admit it. All women deserve to feel beautiful in the clothing they wear regardless of their location. Sure, the fabrics we can get here aren't as fine. My designs won't be worn to the opera or to fancy galas, but they'll be worn to do much more important things. Carter's eyes burned with questions and something else she couldn't quite pinpoint. Like what? Like rocking babies as they fall asleep after a long day on the ranch. She gestured to Kate. Providing the town with much-needed goods and supplies to make their lives a little bit easier. Thinking of Lizzie and how hard she worked in the mercantile, Mia continued. Like teaching their children to love the Lord, leading them in their lessons, filling their families' bellies after hours of hard work, supporting their community, and even working in a clinic to provide much-needed support. Refusing to look away, Mia stayed relaxed in the knowledge she knew her purpose even if Carter didn't understand. Maybe one day, I'll be one of those women who design dresses and send patterns to catalogs back east, but this is plenty for now. In fact, it had been a few of those catalogs and the patterns a woman from Texas named Beth Carson created which had helped her understand what women out west needed with their dresses. There could be lace, but it was typically not stark white and was far more understated than some of the things she might create in a city. The designs needed to be functional for more than being seen, meaning less volume to the skirts and often pockets for gathering eggs and holding children's treasures. The love and care for this way of life Beth wrote into each of her pattern's descriptions told Mia so much about how to create beautiful pieces for women in Mud Lake, and she'd be forever grateful to the woman from Pine Creek, Texas, for that. Carter seemed to accept her answer, but they didn't speak anymore until it was almost time to go. Elijah had begun pitching a fit while baby Hannah squirmed and rooted for her milk. Poor Kate was clearly overwhelmed, and Samuel was obviously torn between his promise to take Mia home and his wife's need for help. Everyone else had already dispersed, with Riley and Paige heading back to their cabin and Liam helping Mara get their twins to bed. "I'm so sorry, Mia," Samuel said as he glanced out the window at the rapidly descending darkness. "Let me help get Elijah settled, and then I'll take you home." "I can take her," Carter said from where he pulled on his heavy coat next to the door. "I'm going that way anyway." It was interesting, this far west. They didn't stand on pretense as much as folks did in New Orleans. There, an unmarried man and woman would never be caught after dark alone, especially if she wanted to keep some shred of a good reputation. They didn't have the same luxury in the West. Samuel's eyes darted between the two of them. "I'll leave it up to Mia." "Mia, if you're not comfortable dash." "It's fine," she assured him. Whatever swirled around in Carter's mind and made him friendly towards her one minute only to act standoffish and cold the next wasn't something that made him dangerous. That much, she knew with every fabric of her being. Grace had told her how he'd helped with the smallpox outbreak in the fall when Ethan had fallen ill, and they'd been alone together exploring the woods a few times now. She trusted him to keep her safe, even if his back and forth made her want to thump him on the ear the way some of the boys at Hope House did to one another. Apparently satisfied, Samuel nodded. "Then that would be very helpful." "Thank you, Carter." "Mia, thanks for coming again." "Do you have the basket Kate packed for Ethan and Grace? They'll be starving if they haven't already eaten." Mia chuckled, well aware of her sister's voracious appetite at this point in pregnancy, but she was saved from answering when Carter grabbed the basket off the table and held it up. "Got it. Thanks for having me, Samuel. I don't get home-cooked meals much these days, so pass along my thanks to Kate as well." With that, Elijah's piercing toddler scream filled the house, as did baby Hannah's displeasure with being made to wait to nurse. Samuel took a deep breath before turning on his heel with a wave to the two of them. "I will. Be safe." Escaping the chaos, Carter and Mia stepped out onto the porch as the moon rose in the still dimly sunlit sky. He stopped, turning curious eyes on her. "Was it always loud like that at Hope House?" "Not always," she said honestly. "Quite often, yes. I've long said our house mothers were angels in disguise. Take that noise and multiply it a few times, then add arguing older children to the mix. It could be quite the circus." It was one reason she'd begged the house mothers to let her take the apprenticeship at 15. Yes, she'd wanted to learn more about being a seamstress, but she'd also wanted a few hours a day to escape the chaos. It was loving chaos, but chaos nonetheless. Carter shuddered, clearly out of his element with small children. "I can't imagine." Chapter 7. As Carter held out a hand to help Mia climb into the wagon, his heart raced a little with the contact. He'd more or less avoided her since the day in the smithy, as he'd felt himself falling harder and harder for the girl he couldn't have. His mail-order bride could send him a letter any day, and Mia wasn't a woman in dire straits who needed help to leave New Orleans. The arrangement with the agency was mutually beneficial, but there was no way he'd ask a woman with options like Mia to marry a small-town blacksmith when she had other options. Those other options, the ones which landed in his belly with a sickening thud, flashed through his mind as he rounded the rig and pulled himself up into the driver's seat. Any single man in town would be a fool not to notice her, and he'd sent glares in the direction of more than a few men he'd already caught doing it. Not to mention, it wouldn't surprise him if one day she up and decided to go back east and design dresses for one of those fancy dressmakers mother and his sisters always went to. He'd barely even released the brake on the wagon when Mia sat back onto the bench seat and crossed her arms over her chest. In the gentle and defiant manner she so often adopted when it came to him, her whole body tensed. Going to tell me why I've not seen hide nor hair of you in over a week? What could he tell her? I'm falling for you when I shouldn't be because I have to get married and I won't even risk you potentially agreeing, would make no sense. He couldn't lie to her either. I'm worried about some things going on at home. She relaxed a little, studying the landscape before them as a gentle snow began to fall from the sky. Tightening her thick coat around her and shoving her hands in her fur muff, her face softened. Where is home, again? Chicago. It hadn't felt like home in a long time, but it was where he was born and raised. What's happening that has you worried? If you want me to mind my own business, just let me know. If you need to talk to someone, I'm told I'm a pretty good listener. He had no doubt about that. Not to mention, Mia saw him. People thought Grace was the only one who managed to see straight to the heart of people, a skill vital to nursing, but Mia had the same talent in spades. At least when it came to him. My grandfather is on the verge of passing away. Pulling a hand from her muff, Mia placed it on his arm. I'm so sorry. I assume you're close? My father died when I was a kid, so grandfather is more like a father to me than anything. My grandparents moved into our house in Chicago after my father died, and he took on my father's role despite his age. He shrugged, glad to at least get that much off his chest. There's also some question about the estate, and I'm worried about what will happen to my mother and sisters when everything is said and done. She was quiet for a moment, but when she did speak, her voice was full of compassion. I'm so sorry. Will they come here? They might, but one of my sisters has a lung condition requiring the help of specialists in larger cities. Being here might help her, but it might also be a death sentence. As much as I'd love to have them here, we can't risk it. So, Mia said cautiously. Are you going back to Chicago? Is that why you've been avoiding me? The hurt in her voice was clear, and it gutted him to know he was the one who'd put it there. They drove along for another minute or two while he pondered his answer, but Mia didn't rush to fill the silence. Evergreens filled the woods in the distance, contrasting the gentle dusting of snow coming down from the sky. All of it was set against the backdrop of the sun slowly dipping behind the mountains in the distance, the white snowflakes trickling before the pink and purple sunset. It wasn't much, and it didn't affect his visibility. He'd rather them not get stuck out in a blizzard if they could help it. A rabbit hopped across the field, probably searching for a den to curl up inside for the night, as a deer stood next to a low-hanging pine and munched on the needles. His life might be in utter turmoil, but nature was unconcerned. I will if I have to, but I'm under a contract with the mine through the end of next year. It was their agreement for letting me split my time between them and the new smithy in town, and at the time, I didn't see any reason to fight them on it. The mine gives me a steady income while I build up the business, but it also locks me into staying here when I'm needed in Chicago. Plus, I'm doing everything I can from here. He didn't bring up his potential bride, still couldn't make himself form the words to Mia. Never in his life had he fallen for someone so quickly, so deeply, not even Eleanor. They'd gotten engaged out of obligation and on a base of friendship. He'd assumed he could fall in love with her one day, or at least have a happy and amicable marriage. They probably could have, if not for her fall from the horse that cold and windy day in March. I don't know how you do it, she said softly as the wagon ambled along. Do what? Carry the world on your shoulders the way you do. My back would hurt something fierce. She let out a tiny chuckle and shot a wink in his direction. I've had a lot to stew over, obviously, but never have I felt like it was all my responsibility. Even when Grace was attacked and we wondered if she'd make it, all I knew to do was take it to the Lord in prayer over and over. There it was. Another reason he couldn't ask Mia to marry him. Her faith was so strong, something she clung to in times of both heartache and triumph. He didn't share it, at least not by more than a tiny, tattered thread, but he'd never dream of laying it all on Mia. Still, it piqued his curiosity. You've never had doubts in all you've been through? None at all? That part, especially knowing how deeply intelligent and thoughtful she was, confused him more than anything. Still, it surprised him when she let out a loud bark of laughter. I'm an orphan who was left on the steps of an awful place when I was mere days old. My sister is carrying the child of a monster, forced to marry in order to save herself from scandal and poverty. Of course, I've had doubts, Carter. I, by nature, am a skeptic. Maybe it's the way I was born, or maybe it developed as a result of the life I've led, but I know doubts. You're a skeptic? Really? It didn't add up with the blind faith she seemed to have, the utter peace in knowing someone else held her future. Absolutely. I think many people confuse skepticism with cynicism, especially in matters of faith. She tilted her head back and allowed the snowflakes to gently prick her face before leaning back up to continue. Doubts don't have to be the destroyer of your faith, Carter. They can be the building blocks of faith if you let them lead you closer to the only one who can give you true wisdom. Cynicism is lazy, assuming bad intent from people and that you've been lied to. Skepticism takes courage. It requires a desire to fight for the faith which took down Goliath, the same one that brought Jericho to the ground. It requires work to come to a place of acceptance for the things you'll never know, but a thirst for knowledge of the things you can. Again, her wisdom despite her young age floored him. How did you gain this knowledge? How did you reconcile your life with a God who is somehow both loving and powerful? That had been his issue since even before Eleanor died. She'd been his best friend, growing up together for years before their families had arranged their engagement. At the time, he'd seen case after case of illness and injury in the hospital which poked holes in all he thought he knew of God. How could he possibly allow a child to die in a fire, their burns causing them more pain than he'd ever known in his whole life? How could he allow a mother with 6 children to die in childbirth, leaving them in the care of an angry and neglectful father? To her credit, Mia didn't offer the platitudes he'd received on more than one occasion. She didn't tell him everything happened for a reason. She didn't implore him to focus on all the good God had done as well. Instead, she sat back in her seat once again and stared out at the road ahead of them. Honestly, I don't know. Sometimes, I wish I did, but not really. It wasn't the Lord who brought sin into the world, but it is Him who redeems it. We brought sin into the world, and with it came pain, hurt, and brokenness. When He redeems it, it's not always in our perspective. Sometimes, there's a much greater plan despite the grief it comes alongside, and He binds up the brokenhearted. I do know this, one day, He will wipe away every tear from our eyes, and He will give us new bodies that don't get sick and broken. As town came into view, they rolled along in silence once again. Somehow, despite the gentle snowfall and soft wind, Mia's light blonde hair remained perfectly placed in the bun she'd had since the morning. A braid ran down the middle of her head, then wrapped in with the rest of her hair save for the curls framing her face. Her dark blue dress was visible only at the bottom due to her coat, but he'd seen how good it looked on her at the Pratt Ranch. Pulling up outside the clinic where she currently resided in the upstairs apartment, Carter continued to think over all she said. He pulled the wagon to a stop as the moon rose higher into the sky, and the lanterns in the clinic window blazed. No one else was out in the cold and new snowfall, likely tucked in front of their fireplaces for the evening. Mia didn't shy away from his gaze, scrutinizing him right back as he turned to face her. As though it had a mind of its own, his hand lifted to hold her chin and run a thumb down the smooth, blushed skin of her cheek. It couldn't go further, as much as he wanted it to. With a sigh of resignation, Carter dropped his hand back to the reins, holding them so tightly the rough leather cut into even his calloused palms, and only released them to hop down from the wagon. "You'd better get inside," he said roughly as he helped her down from the wagon. As though she was a blazing piece of iron he just pulled from the forge, he pulled his hands away immediately. "Is there a wood stove upstairs?" It hadn't occurred to him until just then the clinic didn't have a fireplace, and she couldn't stay in that apartment if it had no way of heating. Masking the clear hurt and confusion, Mia shook her head. "There's a wood stove downstairs, but the pipe runs through the apartment and keeps it plenty warm." Grace also hung some bear hides Ethan traded with some trappers north of town for treating an infected wound. "It keeps it pretty toasty, and he's good about making sure it's all stocked before he leaves in the evening." It wasn't perfect, but it would do. "Good. Have a good night, Mia. He turned on his heel, feeling every bit the coward he was, his long legs eating up the distance between the clinic's front porch and the driver's seat of the rig. He'd return it to the livery, and then he'd head back to his bunk at the mine. The smithy in town had a small apartment in the back, but the chance was too high he'd see Mia in the morning if he waited to head back until the next day. You too, Carter, her softly spoken words floated through the air. Glancing over his shoulder to make sure she got inside, Carter did his best to calm the way his heart threatened to beat out of his chest. He'd almost kissed her, almost showed her exactly how he felt about her, either having to leave her for a mail-order bride or being so selfish as to ask her to step in after. There were no other options if he continued down this road with her, yet something about Mia Middleton drew him in like a moth to a flame in the darkness. Hands tightening once again on the rough leather of his reins, he clicked his tongue to spur the team along, putting some much-needed distance between himself and the woman he couldn't stop thinking about. Chapter 8. Oh, Mia, Lizzie said as she held up the dress Mia had just completed to sell in the store. This is absolutely perfect. I can't imagine how you come up with the designs. Mia blushed, always thankful when someone complimented her dresses. This one is actually adapted from a pattern in a catalog. There's a woman in Texas named Beth Carson who lives on a ranch with her husband and children. She sends designs and patterns to publications back east to be printed and distributed widely. Her designs are a great blend of fashion and function for life outside of the city. She held up the green calico dress with cream-colored accents and ran a hand down the fabric. I utilized a thicker material for the colder winters here and changed the embellishments a little, but it's definitely inspired by Beth's design. This one, she said as she lifted a pale yellow spring piece which had been more a labor of love than anything. This one's all me. Lizzie studied the spring-inspired dress as well, just as impressed and confident both would sell quickly. She'd had Paul fashion her a mannequin like they had in city stores, and she planned to display the dresses in the mercantile's window. You've got a gift, Mia. I can't believe we originally hired you as help for the children and occasional mending. Speaking of the children, the door upstairs opened, and Coralie flew down the stairs with Timothy trotting after her as fast as his short legs would take him. Miss Mia. Look at my drawing. Paul followed them down the stairs, chuckling as he slowed to leave Timothy's room. They heard your voice down here, and she had to come see you. Shoving the paper in her face, Coralie bounded up and down on her tiptoes. Can you tell what it is? The garbled mess of lines and dots initially caught her unawares, but things came into focus as Mia thought back to an adventure she'd taken the children on that morning. A buttercorn? Yes. She kept hopping and turned to face her understandably confused parents. Mia told us this morning in the field about a legendary animal called a unicorn. It has a horn, and it can fly. We made sure to emphasize they weren't real, Mia assured Lizzie as the woman fought a grin. Somewhere along the way, we created another fictional creature that was a cross between a unicorn and a butterfly. It has butterfly wings, a unicorn's body, and 6 legs. Paul burst into laughter, his deep bass booming throughout the mostly empty store. That's a new one, sweetheart. He smoothed back Coralie's wild hair, blonde like her mother's. I love it. They chatted for another minute or so when Lizzie walked Mia out to the porch. We haven't discussed your percentage for the dresses yet. What did you earn in New Orleans for your designs? The truth was, she'd earned a pittance compared to what she should have earned, but she was only an apprentice. I earned 4% of the purchase price, but I'll be honest, it was lower than designers typically earn on custom work. Mia bit her lip, hoping her assertiveness would work out in the long run. Lizzie's eyes widened, and she shook her head wildly. Oh goodness, that's far too low. I'll talk to Paul and see what he thinks is fair, but we certainly wouldn't go under 40%. Considering they'd been the ones to purchase the materials on the dresses, it seemed plenty fair to Mia. Oh, that's wonderful. Now that March had come, the sun peeked through the clouds and warmed her face, reminding Mia of her plans for the rest of the day. We can discuss it later. For now, I think I'm going to walk down to a waterfall Samuel told me about the last time I was at the ranch. It shouldn't be frozen anymore, and he said it's beautiful. Lizzie's entire face lit up. Oh, I know the one you're talking about. Paul took me out there once after I first arrived. Are you going by yourself? A deep voice sounded from behind Mia, one who'd been avoiding her yet again after their almost kiss in front of the clinic. No, she's not going alone. Amusement clouded her boss's features, and her brows raised. Hi, Carter. Well, I'll leave you to it then. As soon as Lizzie had gone back inside, no doubt watching the whole exchange through the window, Mia whirled around to face Carter. What do you mean I'm not going alone? I don't recall extending an invitation. She crossed her arms, narrowing her eyes at the man before her. Blast how handsome he was, and blast the way her heart fluttered with his nearness despite her absolute frustration with the way he'd treated her. Besides, you've been treating me like I had the plague for nearly a month. I'm not sure what type of friendships you've had in the past, Carter Hayes, but we apparently have very different definitions of the word. He let out a long breath, running one of his large hands through his hair. Look, I can't really explain, but you're not going down to the waterfall by yourself. It's not safe, and I don't want you getting hurt. That's so nice of you to care, she deadpanned. I'll be fine. Samuel gave me the directions. I'm sure he figured you'd go with someone. What do you think Grace will do if you get lost in the woods? Isn't she due next month? Do you really think she needs to be out traipsing around and risking a fall? He had her there, and he knew it. Fine. Lead the way then, oh great protector. Flinching, he pursed his lips. I actually have to run down to the mine to deliver a tool they need quickly. Give me 1 hour, and I'll be back to take you. I can pick you up at the clinic. Of course. She'd suddenly gained a babysitter and a delay. Fine, but if you take more than an hour, I'm leaving without you. Don't test me. The smallest of smirks quirked his lip upward, and she couldn't decide if she thought it more endearing or annoying. The clock is ticking, Hayes. Better get a move on. Face shadowing then, Carter's body tensed. Don't leave without me, Mia. I'm serious. It's not safe out there. I make no promises. He grunted his displeasure but turned and strode quickly to where his team and rig waited next to the mercantile's front porch. To his credit, at least he moved quickly. It was hard to reconcile this man who seemed so concerned with her safety with the one who appeared to avoid her at every opportunity, but she couldn't dwell too much on it. Focusing that much on someone else's actions would only make a body bitter when they were ultimately disappointed. No, she'd spent many years cultivating a faith that would hold firm even when those around her didn't act the way they should, and she wasn't about to let Carter or his fickle moods steal her peace. Sure, he was handsome, but she wasn't interested in someone whose attention seemed to shift with the wind. Besides, his faith was as broken as anyone she'd ever seen. Any man she courted would be a man of God, lest she set herself up for a lifetime of heartache. Carter reached the mine in record time, knowing full well Mia would take off into the woods without him if he didn't make it back in the agreed-upon hour. She was angry at him, and she had every right to be. He'd been an awful friend, avoiding her until he could stand it no longer only to perpetuate the confusion further. The mine camp was bustling at this time of day, with men carrying large loads out of the shaft with their wooden wheelbarrows. Each of them was covered in dirt, dust, soot, and all kinds of things no doubt got stuck in their lungs to one day diminish their lung function. Beth Ann had never stepped foot near a mine, but she had been born with the condition which put her into awful coughing fits and trouble breathing. Her doctors had managed to get things under control to some degree, but she still struggled far too much to leave Chicago. Though, if he had to guess, her symptoms would probably be much better out of the city. Hayes. Granger, one of the foremen at the mine, jogged towards him. Just in time. We had a nasty breakdown off the tracks we need your help with. It's mostly halted production, so it's an emergency. He ran a hand down his soot-covered face, the stress of decreased output clear. Granger had been one of the ones to fight hardest with the mine bosses for Carter to split his time between the town and the mine, promising he could finish in 2 days what most men couldn't finish in 5. Stifling the groan bubbling in his belly, Carter nodded. Lead the way. By the time he finished the work nearly an hour and a half later, the mine was back up and running, but Carter's entire body was filled with dread and worry over whether Mia had gone on like she said she would. Of course she did. She's just stubborn enough to do it, and far too careless with her own safety. Granger apparently heard his grumbled complaint, as he looked up from where he pulled the tools from the back of the wagon Carter had come to deliver in the first place. What's that, Hayes? Nothing, Carter said quickly. There wasn't time to explain his relationship with a woman who tied him up in knots, and he wouldn't have gone into it anyway. I've got to get back to town. Send word if you have any more issues, but the track should hold fine. He hadn't even been necessary except for one small piece which needed to be melted and reattached, but he'd promised his loyalty to the mine when he signed his contract. Not to mention, if he did have to go back to Chicago at some point for a bit, he needed all the goodwill with his employers he could get. The foreman bid him goodbye. As Carter directed his team back onto the bumpy road from town, his teeth clenched so tight his jaw started to smart. He knew exactly what he'd find when he got to the clinic, but the frustration bubbling up when he got there and realized the place was locked threatened to choke him. Grace and Ethan were out on a house call, per the sign on the door, and no one answered his knocking. Of course, she'd gone off on her own, but at least he knew which direction she was supposedly headed. The waterfall was about a mile off the road if one entered the trail by the old willow tree in the meadow. It wasn't really a trail necessarily, more so a path worn down by folks forcing their way through the underbrush over the years. The question was, did Mia even know how to find the trail? If she did, would she get into trouble? Chapter 9. Mia gasped at the sight of the waterfall rushing down over the rocks and into the stream below. It was probably only 10 feet tall, but the way the white water contrasted against the deep green moss of the rocks and felled logs surrounding it took her breath away. It felt a little like the fairy stories they'd read as children at Hope House, yet this was very much real. The sun spotted the ground, only lighting up areas where it could creep through bare trees. Most of the trees here were evergreen, so it created a glow off the wet rocks and only enhanced the deep green of the moss. The water crashed down into the stream below, only adding to the experience rather than prove deafening. The sound didn't appear to scare off any of the local wildlife, as a doe made her way into the clearing to get a drink from the stream. The water trickled gently once it moved a few feet from the falls, and the doe's swollen belly seemed to contract and relax as she took long, leisurely sips. I think someone's got a baby coming, Mia said softly as the doe continued to ignore her. The walk down hadn't been a hard one, as townsfolk over the years had clearly worn the path to the point it was easy to follow. Carter would be angry when he realized she'd left without him, but she'd waited the agreed-upon hour. It wasn't her fault he clearly got held up at the mine, or he'd simply changed his mind and decided to disappear again. Either way, it was none of her business. The only plans she had for the rest of the afternoon included sitting here on a cool rock and soaking in the chilly air her body seemed to crave far more than the humid heat of New Orleans. It was clearer, calmer, and far more wild than any landscape she'd ever seen, and the very air in her lungs felt cleansing. It was like she came alive out here, perfectly at home once she'd attained some sensible clothing. Sure, there'd been some weeks through the dead of winter that had felt oppressive in their insistence she stay indoors, but it was March now. Spring would come soon, possibly even as soon as the next few weeks, though she'd been told they'd receive cold nights and snowfall into May. She and the children had ventured out more and more over the past few weeks, searching for frogs down by streams and ponds, and doing their best to identify wildlife tracks from one of the books Paul kept in their apartment. A few more weeks, and she planned to take them for picnics and reading time on the prairie. The lake drew to her, but Timothy was already a handful next to ankle-deep water. She wasn't sure her nerves could take the constant boundary pushing he did due to his age. Instead, they'd continue looking for whatever wildlife they could find to study, and she found herself wishing the two of them were here to watch as the doe drank her fill. The doe took another long drink on the other side of the creek, raising her head just enough to eye Mia with curiosity rather than suspicion. From this angle, her impending birth was clear. My sister, Grace, is about ready to have her baby any minute, too, she said with a chuckle. Look at her, talking to a deer out here in the middle of the woods. I hope everything goes well for you. Honestly, I'm a little worried about Grace. She works so hard, despite her husband's best attempts to get her to rest. The doe continued to study her, probably wondering who was this lunatic talking to her as if she could respond. Mia sat back on the rock and watched the doe for a few more minutes before she drank her fill and moved slowly away. She had white dots on her side, close to her tail, and they almost looked like they formed a heart. The deer looked back at Mia once more, not prancing like she might do when she wasn't weighed down with her precious cargo. "Good luck," Mia whispered through the lump in her throat. It was only then she realized how worried she'd been about Grace's impending birth. She probably had 4 to 6 weeks to go, but it grew closer every day. "Lord," Mia prayed as she closed her eyes and let the sound of the waterfall wash over her. "Please protect Grace as she brings this baby into the world. I know we're not promised an easy time, but if anyone has earned one, it's her. Please protect her and the baby. Let her finally have the family with Ethan she's always longed for." Just as she finished praying, Mia noted the sun's position through the trees and decided it was time to head back. Getting caught out in the woods in the dark would hardly prove her ability to take care of herself to Carter, but she also didn't fancy the idea of spending the night out in the cold. She'd made it about a half-mile down the trail when the sound of a twig snapping and dry leaves rustling brought her up short. "Who's there?" Her body tightened with a wince. Should she have kept her mouth shut? There wasn't time to ponder it, however, as 2 men stepped from behind a cluster of trees. They wore thick leather coats, pants, and fur hats, and hides hung from their belt loops. One had a long gray beard, the other was much younger and only had stubble. "Who do we have here?" It was the younger one who'd spoken, and it was only then Mia noticed the bloody knife in his hand. Logic told her they were trappers doing their jobs, but the glint in both their eyes had her heart thundering in her chest. She didn't speak again, knowing it wouldn't help her, but instead let out the loudest scream she could muster as the men lunged her way. The scream, the one he knew without a lick of doubt, was Mia, cut through Carter's body like a hot knife through butter. Down, down, down it penetrated until he felt it in the depths of his very soul. He just started down the path to the waterfall when he heard it, and in that moment, there wasn't an army on earth who could have kept him from her. "Mia." His yell was primal, almost guttural in its intensity, but he didn't care. Maybe, whoever or whatever had dared threaten a hair on her head would take the hint and leave her be. His long strides eating up the distance between where he'd started and the direction of the scream. He caught sight of a flash of blonde hair against the greens and browns of the forest. In what had to be a death wish, a man around his age, but roughly half his size, clamped a hand over Mia's mouth while he attempted to tug her further into the woods. Another, older man tried to help but doubled over in pain when Mia kicked her foot up and struck him in the gut with a booted foot. Tearing through the trees and underbrush, Carter couldn't even stop to be proud of his little fighter, as every second he wasted brought her further away from the trail. He didn't carry a gun, but he did carry the mallet he'd used to fix the rails in the mine. It was probably better anyway, as there was no way he'd manage to get an accurate shot off with the way his hands shook at the moment. One other time in his life had his hands shaken this way, and that time resulted in the death of a woman he'd sworn his life to. This time, it would end differently. The men finally noticed him as he crashed through the brush not 10 feet from them, and it was only then he realized they must be trappers. The young one shifted his hand from Mia's mouth to hold a bloody knife to her throat, blood he'd better pray was from an animal and not the woman in his arms. "If you want to live, you'll let her go." Mia's eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else there, too. Trust emanated from her gaze in a way that made it impossible for him to let her down. Movement in his peripheral vision alerted him to the older man lunging his way with a knife, but his far superior size kept him from taking it to the gut. With a firm twist of the man's arm, Carter managed to flip him onto his stomach and relieve him of his knife just as the man holding Mia shoved her forward and took off into the woods. Coward. Rather than follow, Carter closed the distance in time to catch her when she stumbled. Tears welled in her eyes, breaking his heart and igniting his anger once again as he realized the old man had scrambled to his own feet and taken off behind his friend. Indecision warred within him. Did he go after them, or did he stay here and make sure Mia got home safely? There, in the thick covering of trees, his decision was made abundantly clear when the tears in her eyes spilled over onto her cheeks. All his reasons for avoiding her went out the window as Carter crushed Mia to his chest, willing his racing pulse to remember she was safe. It could have been much worse than it was. Sobs shook her shoulders as he ran his hand up and down her back, whispering the softest of reassurances as she cried. "That's it, love. Let it out. You're all right. The term of endearment slipped out before he realized it, but it was the truth. He was falling in love with Mia Middleton, regardless of all the things keeping them apart. They stood there a few more moments before Mia took one last shuddering breath and pulled back. Please, she begged softly. Please don't lecture me right now. Her voice was shaky, and the way her voice betrayed her shaken confidence made him want to run off after the men and give them a taste of what it felt like to be manhandled. Still, he couldn't do that and get Mia home safely, so he chose the only option truly available. He dropped his hands from her arms and held one out to help lead her over the brush and back to the path. Wouldn't dream of it. They didn't hurt you, did they? The answer might not help keep him from tearing off into the woods after them, but he had to know. She shook her head, her normally rosy cheeks still redder than normal due to the tears. No, they'd only just grabbed me when you came through the trees. Thank you. Her voice broke, and he didn't drop her hand as they stepped out onto the path. Thank you for coming. Unable to let go, Carter squeezed her hand softly. Of course. I'm sorry I was late in the first place. There was an emergency repair that needed to be made at the mine. If he'd been only a few minutes later, how poorly could the day have ended? No, it was my fault. I went off into the woods alone. No, Carter said as he stopped short and lifted her chin to face him. Hear me, Mia. This wasn't your fault. It was theirs and theirs alone. I may not want you out in the woods alone, but that doesn't place the blame at your feet. She didn't answer immediately, so he dropped her chin and took her hand once more. They were nearly back to the clearing when she sniffed loudly and wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her coat. Please don't tell Ethan and Grace. She's too close to having the baby, and this will bring back memories for her. I don't want it setting her back. That made sense, but it didn't sit well in Carter's chest to tell no one. I won't tell them, but I do think we need to tell Liam. He's the sheriff, and he needs to know who's traipsing around in the woods near town. Chapter 10. Mia nodded, and the two of them made their way to the sheriff's office. Memories of herself and Grace as young children being pulled from their first group home and held at the city courthouse in New Orleans flooded back as she stepped through the heavy wooden door Carter held open for her. The walk back had been mostly silent, but Carter had held her hand tightly and communicated all he needed to in that moment. Liam looked up from his desk, his blonde hair a little longer than it had been when she'd arrived in town. Hi, Carter, Mia, what can I do for you? He stood, gesturing towards the coffee pot in the corner. I've got coffee if you're interested, though I'm warning you I'm not nearly as good as my wife at making it. He grimaced and shrugged his shoulders. I had to break up a fight at the saloon last night, so sometimes sludge is the only thing that does the trick. No, thank you, Carter said as he placed his hand on her lower back to guide her inside. The touch had once sent a jolt of awareness through her, but now it only brought comfort. Liam eyed the movement, and his expression sobered. We need to make a report. Some trappers in the woods tried to attack Mia at the waterfall. Liam clenched his eyes shut, running a hand over his face beneath his Stetson. I'm so sorry, Mia. Are you all right? When his eyes opened, they met hers with compassion and understanding. Still, there was resolve there too, and more than a little worry. His wife, Mara, had experienced more in her life than any woman ever should, and Mia knew that's exactly where his mind had gone. Carter said it tried. I hope they weren't successful. I'm all right, Mia said as she strode forward on trembling legs to the chair Liam pulled out for her. Carter heard me scream and chased them away before they had the chance. Looking down at her hands, she realized they were trembling too. It took everything she had to tell her version of the story without bursting into tears. She told him about the waterfall, even the mother doe, all the way to hearing the noise in the woods and being grabbed. So it doesn't sound like they were following you necessarily, Liam said as he scribbled in his notebook. More like a crime of opportunity. He nodded, scribbling some more, before facing her again. It's not your fault, Mia. I hope you know that. She did, despite her first instinct as she and Carter left the woods. All she'd been doing was walking in the woods. Some might think it unwise, but a woman ought to be able to walk in the woods without an escort to be safe. At least from human predators. I do, thank you. It wasn't long after I screamed that Carter burst through the trees. He'd looked like a warrior, strong, angry, and feral as he'd come to her rescue. It was such a stark contrast to how he normally was with her, it jarred her even now. I was supposed to meet her to go down to the falls, Carter growled. I got held up at the mine. If I'd been there dash. You were there, Liam interrupted. You were there when she needed you. We can't dwell on what could have happened or what should have happened. All we can do is focus on what's in front of us. I'd like to hear your end of things, Carter. As Carter gave his testimony, Mia did her best to check out of the conversation. Maybe, if nothing else, it would help ease the trembling in her hands. The jailhouse in Mud Lake was far smaller than those in New Orleans. It only had 3 cells, and all 3 were empty despite there being a fight at the saloon last night. Letting her mind wander to study the rest of the building, Mia didn't even realize Liam spoke to her until Carter gently tapped her arm. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm not sure where I went. Smiling encouragingly, Liam shook his head. That's fine. I want you to know I'm going to go out today and take a look, but it won't surprise me if they packed up their camp and hightailed it out of town. He sat back in his chair, tapping his pen against his chin. I think I'll also see if Samuel can spare a few hands to help me canvass the woods nearby too. Honestly, I don't think we'll find much, but I'll do everything I can. Truthfully, Mia thought she'd rather the men leave town and never come back. Of course, it meant they might do the same to someone else, but she hoped and prayed that wasn't the case. Thank you, I don't want them to come upon any other woman and be successful. Liam took a long breath. If they do, I pray it's a woman like my wife who carries a pistol and isn't afraid to use it. His jaw clenched again, and it was clear the scene played out in his mind. Thank you both for coming in. I'll let you know what we find. He stood, and the 2 of them followed suit, with Mia grateful she could go back to her apartment and have a good cry alone. Once again, Carter placed his hand on the small of her back as she stepped over the threshold, bringing as much peace and security as it had on the way in. As the 3 of them stepped back out onto the jailhouse porch, Ronald from the post office waved from just down the street. Ah, Carter, there you are. You received a letter a few days back, but I haven't been able to catch you. Come on by before the close of business today, if you get a chance. You can go now, Mia said with a forced smile. The clinic's right across the street. I'll be fine. She pressed her lips together in something between a grin and a grimace, but he knew beyond any doubt she'd be crying into her pillow the second she got upstairs to her apartment. What would walking her back accomplish? It wasn't like he could go inside without alerting Grace and Ethan something was wrong, and Mia had already started to turn to head down the steps. I'll come check on you tomorrow. Try to get some sleep. Nightmares after an event like that were common. Goodness knew he'd had enough after Eleanor's accident. She turned back just slightly to meet his gaze once again, her voice thick with unshed tears as she spoke. Thank you again, Carter. Thank you, Liam. Somehow, despite being so roughly treated, her hair still barely had a strand out of place. Her clothes were impeccable too, leading Carter to wonder what other hardships she hid behind her beauty. It was all still on his mind as Carter left to follow Ronald to the post office, part of him feeling split in 2. It was undoubtedly another letter from Marnie. Had grandfather passed? Had Uncle Pruitt somehow had a change of heart? The bell above the post office door jingled, and Carter stood at the counter while Ronald rummaged through a basket of mail. Ah, here it is. His eyes twinkled, like that of a meddling but well-meaning grandparent. I've been waiting for another one of you boys to send off for a bride. All the girls who've come so far have been right pretty ones. Sorry about the envelope, by the way, it got a little wet on the way here. Stomach dropping to the floor, Carter studied the return address. It wasn't from Chicago, it was from New Orleans. More specifically, it was from Mrs. Miller's bridal agency in New Orleans, Louisiana. Clenching his eyes shut, Carter wrenched open the envelope, which felt like it weighed more than the anvil he used in the smithy. Finally, after nearly 5 months, he'd been matched. He had a bride, and she'd be coming soon. Chapter 11. Mia scrubbed the floor in the clinic, her shoulders aching with the movement. Yet again, Carter had more or less disappeared. He'd kept his word not to tell Grace or Ethan about what had happened with the trappers, but he'd also barely acknowledged she existed at church or when he saw her in town. The likelihood of Liam ever finding the men who'd tried to accost her was slim, but she'd done as Carter asked and reported it. Not even sure why he goes to church anyway, Mia grumbled. It's not like he believes a lick of what Pastor Ben is saying. Immediately, conviction washed over her, and she sat back on her heels on the freshly scrubbed wood floor. I'm sorry, Lord. I should never begrudge someone for going to church, especially those who are drowning in doubt. It's the best place for them to be. Still, why can't I forget about him? It was all she wanted, especially now he'd begun treating her like she had the plague yet again. Earlier this evening, he'd been heading across the street towards the mercantile when she'd finished up with the children and came through the door. Rather than pass her like a mature adult, he turned on his heel to move in the other direction. It was ridiculous, and Mia didn't know she'd ever been more frustrated with a man. She spent the next half an hour scrubbing the floors until they shined, working out as much of her frustration on the wood and fabric as she could so she didn't slap Carter the next time she saw him. Before, it had felt like a personal issue with him, and it probably still was. He was the only person other than Liam to know what had happened to her. To then abandon her felt like more of a betrayal than when they were simply friends. Tossing the rag in her bucket, Mia took a deep breath and stared out the window. It was spring, and the town had woken from its winter slumber the same way the wildflowers in the field had. Folks ambled up and down the street, no doubt heading home or to the restaurant for dinner. Mara passed with her twin girls, heading towards Liam's office. She held one of the toddlers by the waist as the girl kicked and screamed while the other simply held her hand and walked quietly. She'd heard from Kate one of the girls was Mara made over, and in the moment, it was fairly clear who was who. Grace and Ethan were gone to dinner at Ben and Tessa's, but she'd decided to stay home. Carter kept worming his way deeper and deeper into the friend group Grace had built for herself, and she didn't have the stomach to sit and watch Carter look anywhere but her for a whole meal. Just then, the door to the new smithy opened down the street, and Carter moved through it. His shoulders were hunched, as though the weight of the world rested on them. Joshua, the wrangler from Samuel's ranch, followed. Honestly, she didn't feel all that sorry for the blacksmith. He could have shared some of his burden, but the second he started to open up to anyone, he shut right down again. As though they moved with a mind of their own, Mia's feet were halfway to the door before she even realized she'd stood from her kneeling position. The bell above the clinic door jingled cheerfully, a complete contrast to the storm brewing in her own heart. It was early spring now, and the sun shone cheerfully overhead, another clear message nature wasn't concerned with her and Carter's problems. Barely restraining herself from stomping across the street, Mia spoke loudly enough for him to hear when she got within 10 or so feet of the man who'd occupied far more of her thoughts than he deserved for the last few months. Carter. She hadn't shouted, but her tone left little question regarding her mood. Joshua's brows rose so high they nearly disappeared in his Stetson, his mouth opening a little in surprise. Hey, there, Mia. You all right? He was tall, though not as tall as Carter, his lean muscle strong due to years on the ranch. He glanced behind her in concern, as though someone might be following her, but shrugged and shook his head. With every bit of sweetness she could muster, Mia grinned. Yes, I'm fine. I need to speak with Mr. Hayes. Her attention now back on Carter, the smile had dropped and her fists clenched at her sides. Mia had always considered herself a fairly controlled person, not given to fits of emotion or hysteria, but the man before her brought out the worst. Do you have a moment? He nodded, his expression sheepish and somewhat guilty. Good, at least he was aware of how awful he'd been to her. Joshua nodded quickly, stepping away with his hands up in surrender. You do that, ma'am. Carter, I'll see you next week. A faint whistle split the air from where Joshua took his leave. As the wrangler all but jogged off down the street to the livery, Mia turned her attention back to Carter, her eyes narrowed and whole body tense. Oh look, you do possess the ability to remain in my vicinity for more than 3 seconds. It's a miracle, as I thought we'd become repellent of one another. Crossing her arms over her chest, Mia raised a brow at the man in question. You witnessed one of the most terrifying moments of my life, Carter. You're one of the 2 people in this town who know about it, and it didn't occur to you that I might want to talk about it a time or 2 after the fact? What did I do to make you so angry you treat me like a pariah? Why do you swing from friendly, kind, and protective to repulsed by my very presence? She might be drawing an audience, but at this point she didn't even care. The church and parsonage were the only buildings close enough to hear, and she was past pretending none of this hurt her. I'm not repulsed by you, Mia, Carter said thickly. No one could ever be repulsed by you. Could have fooled me. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't handle this well at all, but please trust one had my reasons for disappearing the way I did. It didn't occur to me you'd want to talk things through, but please know avoiding you is the last thing I've ever wanted to do. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back. Then why do it? He didn't speak for a moment, the war in his mind clearly raging as he stared at the dirt below him. I'm getting married. Was it possible to feel a heartbreak? To hear it shatter? Physical pain bloomed in her chest, quickly followed by more anger. Why, you've been engaged all this time? Her words came out clear, but her entire body felt as though it crumbled in on itself as she stared at the man she thought she knew before her. They'd never done anything technically improper, but she'd have distanced herself from him significantly if she'd known he was spoken for. He shook his head quickly, his eyes seeming to beg her to understand. No, I sent off for a mail-order bride back in the fall. I didn't know I'd been matched until that day Ronald came and told me I had a letter. I'm so sorry for not telling you, but I didn't know. What do you mean you didn't know? You sent suddenly, her words were cut off when Ethan ran towards them from Ben and Tessa's house as Tessa lagged behind. Grace grimaced, her face scrunched up in clear pain. Oh, no. Grace? It was Tessa who turned to answer, but by then Mia had broken into a run to follow the group towards the clinic. She's gone into labor, and it's progressing very quickly. Worry and dread crowding out all the anger and hurt she'd felt a moment before, Mia ran up the steps behind Ethan, Grace, and Tessa, only realizing then Carter had followed. Not that he could be much help, but her anger melted away in the midst of the situation before them. This was her sister and her niece or nephew's life in the balance, and the fear on Ethan's face as he lowered Grace onto the clinic's patient bed told her exactly how abnormal it was for her to have already experienced 2 heavy pains in the few moments since they'd first left Ben and Tessa's. Once Grace was settled, Ethan went to the foot of the bed, mouthing words no one else could hear as he washed his hands. Tessa, Mia, you 2 can stay up by her head. I'm going to check and see what type of progress she's making. Carter hadn't followed them into the patient room, instead staying outside to wait patiently. Of course, he hadn't come in, but Mia found herself longing for the calm his presence brought that day in the woods. Once he'd arrived, she'd known it was going to be all right. Still, this wasn't about her. It was about Grace. Ethan, Mia breathed quietly. It's so fast. Have you ever attended a labor this fast? He took his place at the foot of the bed, his pallor a little pinker now than it had been earlier, but his eyes still told more of the story than his lips did. Once. No one asked how the birth had gone, and Mia wasn't about to do it. Grace's pain subsided as Ethan guided her legs to a bent position, her relaxing in a heap onto the pillow as sweat dotted her forehead. Mia dabbed the sweat from her brow and stroked her hair gently. You're doing great, Gracie. Whatever Ethan did at the bottom of the bed had his face screwing up in concentration and her sister tensing in pain. She shut her eyes, and Mia knew she was begging the Almighty to deliver this baby safely. Mia's silent prayers joined her sister's, and a quick look at Tessa's moving lips told her she'd done the same thing. Ethan's hands moved again, and Grace's back bowed in pain. Mia, her brother-in-law said quietly. Is Carter still out in the waiting room? I think so. Why? Do you need me to ask him to send for someone? Ethan shook his head. Go get him. I need his help. What in the world? All right. Hurrying into the waiting room, still confused at what help Carter could possibly be, Mia jerked her head towards the patient room. Ethan needs your help. He didn't respond, only closed the distance between his current spot and the door in 2 long strides, eyes meeting hers briefly before stepping around her to wash his hands and forearm at the sink by the window. What's going on? His question wasn't directed at her, so she didn't answer. Taking her spot next to her sister's head once more, Mia resumed praying. Lord, I don't know what's happening, but you do. Protect my sister and her baby. Bring them both through this. Carter swiftly dried his hands on the clean towel hanging beside the sink. What's going on? Shoulder dystocia. How comfortable are you with forceps? Ethan spoke through more emotion than would be helpful when attending a complicated birth. Oddly enough, the anxiety he'd felt regarding medical issues didn't bubble up the way it had since Eleanor died. Even at the mine, he jumped into his role as caregiver and healer until Ethan got there, but the fear had always threatened to choke him. This time, it didn't. Watching all 3 women with their eyes clenched shut, Tessa's lips moving quickly, it occurred to him maybe there was more to it than time. Comfortable enough. Where are yours? He'd attended more than one birth in Chicago, as midwives typically delivered women at home unless there was a known issue. Some of those issues would be breech babies or those suspected to be too large to safely pass through the birth canal. How the midwives knew these things, he had no idea, but they were often correct in their assumptions. Instead of Ethan, it was Grace who answered breathlessly. 3rd cabinet, top shelf. Do what you need to. She knew exactly what was about to happen, as she'd worked in a large hospital in New Orleans before coming to Mud Lake. Dousing the instruments he needed in carbolic acid to kill any bacteria that lingered, he met her now wide eyes. Grace, this is going to be very painful, but I think you know that. Don't worry about me. Save him. Please. Mia's head flew up at that, tears flowing down her cheeks silently, but Tessa spoke aloud. Lord, she said, as Mia stroked her sister's head. Calm the pain in Grace as she brings this baby into the world. He's yours, Father, first and foremost. Even more peace settled over Carter as he worked beside Ethan. Together, they managed to clamp the forceps onto the baby's shoulder and guide him into the face-down position to allow him through the birth canal. They didn't pull, never pull, rather simply guided with the instruments to help them get a better grip. Grace cried out, but then quieted as she clenched her eyes shut once again. Her body did most of the work from there, pushing the large baby out into Ethan's waiting hands. The baby didn't immediately cry, and his skin had a purplish tint to it that needed to be rectified quickly. As Carter clamped the cord and worked to deliver Grace's placenta, Ethan cut the baby's umbilical cord and laid the baby boy down, using suction to clean out his lungs. Come on, big guy, Carter muttered as he listened for the telltale cry. Lord, it's been a long time since I did this. If you're listening, if you care at all, please. Another 5 seconds of the only sound being suction before the most beautiful, screeching cry filled the room. Every single adult breathed a sigh of relief, and tears pricked Carter's eyes as he breathed a silent thank you to the God he hadn't been too sure was even real for a long time. Chapter 12. Mia walked Carter out onto the front porch of the clinic, confusion and hurt warring in her mind for the top spot. Take a walk with me. It wasn't a question, and she didn't ask it as one. This may be the last time she and Carter got to speak, especially if he had a bride on the way, and she intended to get the answers he held so close to his chest. They walked for a moment, heading towards the lake's trail without discussing their destination. It was fitting, as it was where they'd taken one of their first walks. Might as well be their last. He hadn't spoken since they left the clinic, simply followed her across the road, through the clearing, and onto the trail. Awkwardness hung in the air between them, but she didn't feel the need to dispel it until they were well within the lake trail whose trees had already begun to bud in the early spring warmth. So, she said as she continued to lead the way through the brush which had overgrown since folks didn't frequent this area during the winter. I think it's time I ask some questions, and I'd really appreciate it if you gave me the answers. He'd known exactly what to do with Grace, his hands and mind that of a healer rather than an artist and a blacksmith. The layers to Carter Hayes were abundant, but they also hid a darkness in him. Whether it was of his own making or one thrust upon him, she planned to find out. Might be best if I start at the beginning, he said softly. If you've got time. It's a long story. I've got nothing but time. Grace and Ethan would be bonding with their baby for the next few hours, and her sister needed rest. She'd go over later to check on them, but for the time being, this was where she was needed. They crested the trail head onto the lake's beach, and she plopped down onto a felled log, patting the spot beside her. "Tell me." Carter sighed and took a seat, his eyes not leaving the lake as he spoke. "I grew up in Chicago. My grandfather and father were wealthy businessmen in the realm of banking and finance. They worked together, and for a while, it was assumed I'd follow in their footsteps. Instead, I had a passion for medicine, a desire to help heal the sick partially because my sister has a lung condition which has plagued her since she was a girl." "What's her name?" Creating a picture of Carter's life required some specificity, at least. "Your sister." "I have two, but Beth Ann is the one who's sick. Marnie's the other one, and they both live in Chicago in the house I grew up in along with my mother. I told you my father died when I was a child in a shipwreck on the way to London, and my grandfather became like a father figure to me. He supported me when I didn't want to go into business, instead financing medical school for me and pulling strings with one of the best hospitals in the country when I graduated. He always said I'd inherit his fortune when he died, but there was one condition. The pieces were starting to come together, but only slightly." "What's that?" "To answer that, I need to say my grandparents were more in love than any couple I've ever met. They married as many in their station do, arranged by their parents to provide an advantageous match for their children. Still, that relationship grew from strangers to friends, to hopelessly in love in the first year or so of their marriage. Grandfather has always said marrying grandmother not only calmed his wild ways, but something about her steadied him and helped him become the man he ought to be. She died far too young, and it had never even occurred to grandfather to remarry. Rosemary, grandmother as she was known to him, was the love of his life." Carter stood, moving a few steps towards the water, still speaking as he shoved his hands in his pockets. "His stipulation for me inheriting his fortune was that I marry. So, when I graduated from medical school and had gotten my first job, an engagement with my childhood friend Eleanor was arranged. The thought of Carter with anyone sent a prick of jealousy straight into Mia's heart, but she had no more rights to this man's past than she did to his future. Willing it to calm, she nodded despite the fact he couldn't see her. "Was it something you both wanted?" "It was expected, and she was one of my closest friends. We'd grown up in homes next door to one another, as my grandparents had moved into our home when my father passed, so my sisters and I didn't have to be uprooted. Eleanor's family was another wealthy one in Chicago, and her father owned several manufacturing plants. More than that, we liked each other fine, though neither of us were particularly attracted to one another." With that, he turned, his dark eyes piercing hers. "One evening, a few weeks before we were to wed, Eleanor and I went out for a ride on some property my family owned. We both loved riding horses, as it was something we'd learned together as children. An unexpected spring storm popped up, something spooked the horse, and Eleanor was thrown. I've gone over that moment in my head so many times, but I've never really figured out what happened. The thunder was only in the distance, and we'd begun riding back. The gelding had suddenly bucked anyway. Riding side saddle as she did, there was no way to stay on. Heart sinking, Mia stood from the log. "Oh, Carter." She hit her head, and there was nothing I could do. Add that to the fact I'd had 2 different patients at the hospital die from things which could have been prevented if they'd had the money to seek help sooner, and something inside me broke. After her funeral, I walked away from medicine, walked away from Chicago and my family. It broke my mother's heart and my grandfather's too, but they've always supported me." "Where did you go then?" "I was lost and angry, but I managed to find work rather than trouble in a sawmill up in Vermont. At first, I worked with the rest of the team felling trees and bringing them to the mill, but eventually the blacksmith there at the camp noticed me. He said I had the build for what he did, and he asked if I'd like to apprentice. I agreed, still too angry and lost to much care what I did. Somehow, that apprenticeship saved part of me." Mia approached him then, barely holding herself back from reaching out to touch his arm. "The physician in you was still angry, but the artist found healing in the craft. That much, she knew without him telling her a thing. Artists needed to create, it was as much a core requirement as breathing. Without it, they'd crumble. I guess it did. I finished my apprenticeship and worked there for a few more years until the company changed hands. At that point, I saw a posting about the job here, and I figured I had nothing to lose. Colorado seemed like a fresh start, and I've been here since. It's been fine until now. The rest of the story she knew. His grandfather was dying, and he had to marry in order to save the house and fortune for his sisters. I have one more question for you, Carter, and you don't have to answer this one if you don't want to. He swallowed thickly but nodded. I'll answer, but after today, I have to walk away. It's not fair to my bride or to you to continue this friendship, especially not when all I want to do when I look at you is brush a blonde curl from your face and kiss you. Well, that answered one question. Mia's sharp intake of breath didn't stop her words, but it did slow them a little. Why didn't you ask me to marry you? Why wasn't I good enough? The pain on his face had her wishing she could take the words back, but she had to know the answer. They stood there, staring at each other. He just admitted to wishing he could touch her. Her hand itched to do the same, but they couldn't. It wouldn't be right. Mia, he said with a croak. You are any man's dream, but I won't sentence you to a marriage of convenience with a poor blacksmith who's only marrying so he can turn over his inheritance to his mother and sisters. Not to mention, my Uncle Pruitt is a vindictive man. My bride and I will have to travel to Chicago to make this happen, and I'll keep her safe. There is no way I could focus on the task at hand if it was you in potential danger. You, he paused for a moment, gazing at his hands before looking up to her again. You've come to mean too much to me. Not to mention, you deserve a man who shares your faith with certainty. That's not me, Mia, and I don't know if it ever can be again. By the time they'd made the short, sad walk back to town, Carter could all but feel his heart breaking in his chest. Mia was everything he could ever want in a woman, but he couldn't have her. The reasons that kept him from pursuing her were just as real now as they had been months ago, and the fact he'd already sent off for a mail-order bride before they met just sealed their fate. After he made sure she got back to the clinic safely, surely aiming to go check on her sister and new nephew, Carter made his way back to the smithy in town. He had a small apartment there, and it would be more comfortable than the bunkhouse down at the mine for sure. Whether he'd sleep that night, he had no idea, but at least he'd be alone. He just passed the livery when he spotted two figures in Stetsons leaning against the side of the building, arms crossed as they talked. Closer inspection revealed Samuel and Joshua, his wrangler from the ranch, and the realization they were supposed to meet that afternoon to pick up their orders washed over Carter with embarrassment and frustration. I'm sorry, fellas. It's been quite the day, and I forgot all about you two coming into town. That's all right, Samuel said with an understanding nod. Heard Grace had her baby, and you stepped in to help. How's she doing? The way he said it, without the least bit of confusion, told Carter that Ethan must have shared some of his background with the rancher, even if it wasn't all of it. Doing great when I left. Grace is stronger than folks give her credit for. Joshua barked out a laugh. There's not a single one of those Hope House women who don't have spines of steel. Even the quiet ones like Paige can pack a punch when they need to. He snickered, clearly in on some sort of inside joke Carter wasn't privy to. Of course, they are, Samuel said as he stood up straight. They've had to be. Do you have our orders ready, or should we come back tomorrow? Thankful for the change in subject, Carter hurried towards the door. Oh, they're ready. I'll just wrap them up, and you can take them home tonight if you'd like. A grin spread over Samuel's face, and he followed Carter inside. Kate's going to love it, he said softly as the same look of utter devotion he always had when he spoke about his wife came over his face. I can't tell you how much I appreciate your work on this. It's been a fun project, Carter admitted. I've been wanting to do more things like this for a while, so you gave me an excuse. Leading them around the counter, nerves flopped in his gut as he removed the covering from the gate. What do you think? He'd gotten a little carried away on the flourishes and details in the process of forming the grates, but it had turned out even better than expected. I can still fix something if dash. No, Samuel said with an almost giddiness Carter had never seen from the cowboy. It's perfect. Turning, he offered his hand to Carter to shake. "You're worth the price we agreed on and much more, Hayes." "Thank you." The pleasure of knowing his client was happy almost dulled the ache from his conversation with Mia by the lake, almost. "That means a lot. I'm glad you like it." Samuel studied him for a moment, but Carter couldn't bring himself to shrink back from the scrutiny. "Listen, Carter, I know you come to church and everything, but something in me is telling me to say this. If you ever have any questions about the Bible or your faith, or need someone to talk things through with, I'd be happy to." Clearly uncomfortable, Samuel placed his hands in his pockets again. "I know it's none of my business. I've just been trying to be more sensitive to the Lord's leading lately. So let me know, will you? Even if it's something I can be praying about." Joshua had busied himself over by the tools Carter had created for him, clearly just as pleased as Samuel was with the gate. Did he dare take Samuel up on the offer? It had been so long since he'd allowed any type of scripture to do anything but go in one ear and out the other, but that really hadn't worked out for him all that well. He had none of the peace he sensed in the cowboy, none of the hope he sensed in Mia. Maybe, if he could find a little bit of that light Pastor Ben always talked about, things wouldn't always feel so dark. "You know what, Pratt? I think you might have yourself a deal." Chapter 13. "Oh, Grace," Kate said as she held baby Nehemiah close to her chest. "He just gets sweeter and sweeter every time I see him. I can't believe he's nearly a month old already." They'd come out that morning to spend some time at the ranch and get together with the rest of the ladies from Hope House. Grace had the youngest baby, but Kate's baby, Hannah, was still fairly young as well. Neither of them minded, and Mia had been happy to drive Grace and the baby out in one of the rigs Ethan rented from the livery. Mara took a sip of her tea. "How are you feeling?" "I feel better than I expected," Grace replied. The birth was quick and scary at one point, but Ethan and Carter saved his life. She gazed lovingly at her son, nearly bringing tears to Mia's eyes at how sweet it was, and took a shuddering breath. "I'm so grateful." Mara stroked Nehemiah's little hand from her spot next to Kate and raised a brow. "I still don't understand Carter's background. So, he was a doctor but is now a blacksmith?" Her gaze fell pointedly to Mia, but she didn't call her out. "I guess it's none of my business, I'm curious." Mia didn't respond, and her sister saved her from having to. Grace was privy to more of the details of their almost relationship than any of the others, but even she didn't know everything. Still, Liam had quite obviously eyed Carter's hand on her back that day at the jailhouse, and Mara was observant enough to notice things others didn't. "That's his story," Grace said. "Oh, I had a few questions for you ladies about nursing newborns. I'm having the hardest time getting him to stay awake long enough for a full meal, so he ends up snacking all day and night." Bless Grace for changing the subject. As expected, the conversation quickly changed into advice and anecdotes from raising their own newborns, as it often did when groups of married women got together. After they'd assured Grace sleepy newborns were completely normal, the conversation moved back into stories of their own births and recoveries. Mia didn't mind, and one day hoped to be able to participate as well, but it simply wasn't a stage of life she'd entered. Hoping she could slip out with no one noticing, her hope was dashed when Kate called her name. "Oh, Mia, I'm so sorry. We don't have to talk about babies all the time, and we certainly don't have to share our horror stories from birth if it makes you nervous." Tessa snorted, a grin wide across her face. She and Ben had adopted 4 children, but they'd not had any biological ones yet. "I doubt any of you can help yourselves." She said it kindly, not the least bit of bitterness in her tone as she chuckled. "I'm not sure any woman can. It's something that bonds many of us," Paige said thoughtfully. "But not all, so we certainly shouldn't let it monopolize the conversation." Mia shook her head then, a sly smile spreading that she hoped would show them the truth of her words. "I actually wanted to go see Phoenix and see how Joshua's coming along with her." She hadn't even thought about what mentioning the Wrangler would bring up in their minds until Mara's brows rose suspiciously. "Joshua, huh? Has he caught your eye, Miss Mia?" "Not in the slightest," she replied. "He is the keeper of the horses, and I love to watch them when I come out here." She couldn't remember the first time she'd seen Phoenix. It had been some time when she'd come out with Grace. The horse was beautiful, her chestnut coat fuller and healthier every time she'd seen her. Unfortunately, the fear in her eyes still hadn't abated. Something Samuel said worried Joshua immensely. "I can vouch for that," Kate said with a wink. She loves to go visit Phoenix and Millie, even when Joshua is out in the pasture with the men. "I'm fairly certain the draw there is of the four-legged variety, but either way you need to mind your business, Mara Pratt." Tessa barked out a laugh, one that made all of them join in. Now, since when has she ever done that? By the time Mia managed to slip out the front door and head to the corral where Millie and Phoenix grazed, it felt like a piece her soul had been longing for. She loved spending time with the other women and their babies, but knowing Carter's new bride would arrive any day now had been difficult for her to keep inside. No one knew, save maybe Grace and Lizzie, how close the two of them had gotten. Grace had only briefly asked her about their confrontation that day in town. Still, every time she saw him in the distance, at church, or around town, her heart felt a little more tender and bruised. The woman who married Carter Hayes would be getting a complicated man, but she'd be getting a good one. He was right. There wasn't much they could do if he was still so far from the Lord, and she respected the fact he didn't want to tie her to someone who didn't share her faith, but why couldn't her heart get the message? Watching Phoenix and Millie in the pasture felt cathartic, in a way. The mountains rose up in the distance, and the creek trickled down from majestic peaks still adorned with snow. Millie playfully nipped at Phoenix, and the two of them took off running through the pasture looking like Coralie and Timothy when she set them loose to roam. Suddenly, a clearing throat behind her had the same familiar warmth and nerves passing through her that always did when he was near. "How's Phoenix doing?" Carter's voice was hesitant, the bass in his voice a little unsure. Joshua said he's been struggling through her rehabilitation. She didn't turn to look at him as he approached the fence, watching the two animals frolic with the mountains and fields in the background the same way she did. "She seems to be healthy, at least. He'll get through to her. She just needs more time." How she possibly knew that, she had no idea, but it was the truth. "What brings you out here?" Carter hesitated for a moment, and she wondered if she'd overstepped. "I've actually been coming out here twice a week for about a month. Samuel is leading me through some of the questions I've had about faith and the Bible." As though of its own accord, Mia's head whipped around to face him. "That's wonderful, Carter. Why didn't you tell me?" He picked at a frayed string on his pants, one she could fix if they were still friends. "I didn't want you to think I was just doing it to get back in your good graces. Not to mention, I didn't need to have that motivation either. I guess I've been thinking about things lately. I was going to come by the clinic this week and discuss it with you, but maybe this is a sign from the Lord that now's as good a time as any." "Discuss what?" The hope in her voice pricked her heart once more. It would hurt, whatever he had to say, if it was anything short of what she'd been longing for. He lifted his eyes to hers, close enough to kiss her if he wanted to. "I've decided I'm going to pay to send my mail-order bride back to New Orleans. Or I'll pay to set her up here. Whatever she wants. I know none of those ladies have left New Orleans under great circumstances, so I'll do right by her. I can't marry the woman when I know my heart's gone over another." Mia's heart leapt into her throat, and she knew her mouth had fallen open in shock. "Another?" "Mia Middleton, I fell in love with you the day I saved you from slipping on the ice outside the mercantile, and I'll love you until my dying breath. I won't say I'm as far on my faith journey as I'd like to be. I'll understand if the answer's no, but at least we're moving in the same direction now. I don't know if my grandfather has months or years left, but it's more likely the former." Mia pulled back from the fence, her heart thumping wildly in her chest as she tried to convince herself this was real. It felt like a dream the man who'd occupied so many of her thoughts since the day she arrived in town would possibly be in a place with his faith they might move forward. Not to mention, she would be his bride. "Wait, you said you sent to the same agency as Samuel and Liam did. Is your bride from Hope House? Who is it?" Maybe it was an odd question, odd timing to be sure, but the other young women who were around her age at Hope House deserved to be happy as well. There was Kirsten, the bubbly and wickedly smart writer who was reading before she started her official lessons simply from things she picked up. Abby was another who was the quiet and gentle spirit with a head for numbers and a heart for drawing and painting. Tori, the spitfire of a girl who'd never met a challenge she wouldn't face, never met a bully she wouldn't try to take down. She was the perfect mixture of Mara and Tessa, somehow utterly confident in who she was while also rendering both headaches and unspeakable pride in the house mothers. The girl loved adventure, and it would be right up her alley to go west as a mail-order bride. Then there were the girls who'd come out of Bradford Marbury's brothel, where Tessa and Ben had worked to rescue the girls after Grace had tried to help but had gotten attacked in the process. Jade, Victoria, Elizabeth, and Susan had all come to Hope House when Mia stayed there to help after she technically aged out. She never got to know them well, spending most of her time at the dress shop, but they'd all been through the fire. Could she possibly be responsible for stealing one of their grooms? Carter shrugged. I don't actually know. The part of the letter with her name on it got wet in transit, and we haven't exchanged any since. I know she's to arrive any day now, but it's been a few weeks so I don't think it was an emergency. Honestly, I can't imagine any woman would want to marry a man who's in love with someone else. Would you? His gaze bore into hers, both pleading and not pressuring at the same time. No, I wouldn't. For the first time since he'd held her after she'd been grabbed in the woods by the trappers, Carter lifted his hand to cup her cheek, running his thumb down it slowly. I wouldn't either. You don't have to marry me, today or ever, but I can't in good conscience marry a woman when my heart belongs to you. If it means I have to go to Chicago and somehow find a place for my mother and sisters to lodge, I'll do it. You're it for me, Mia, and this time not speaking to you has been both torture and absolute confirmation of that fact. Why did she sound so breathless? When did you have this realization? Could it be a coincidence they were both at the ranch that day? That he so happened to approach when she stepped outside? The serious glint to his expression was replaced with the amusement of a mischievous little boy caught with his hand in the cookie jar. I told you I've been coming out here twice a week for a month. I was honest with Samuel about my feelings for you, and we've been praying about them quite a bit. He told me at church yesterday that you ladies would be here during our meeting today, and I may have hung around a little after we finished in the hopes you'd step outside by yourself. He shrugged, his normally olive cheeks pink. Maybe that's a little weird, but it's the truth. I've stayed away for your good and to be a man of integrity, but I think there might be more than one way to do that. As Phoenix and Millie slowed their game of running to graze in the pasture beside them, a breeze wafted from the mountains, bringing with it the scent of beauty and new beginnings. So I'm clear, you plan to stop this swing between seeking me out and avoiding me? I can't do that anymore, Carter. I need you to be sure. I'm sure, and if you'd have me, I'd marry you today. I do think I need to court you properly for a bit, as my grandfather is still on this side of death for now. That could all change tomorrow, so I need to know what you're thinking. What was she thinking? This was all so unexpected, something she'd have never in a million years thought would happen. He was still so new in his faith, but he might be needing a wife sooner rather than later. Lord, lead me. Let's see where this takes us, Mia said softly. If the timeline needs to be sped up, we can talk about it again. A smile stretched across Carter's face, his broad build slightly more boyish as it did. I'd really like to kiss you right now, Mia, but I don't want Mara to come out here and whack me with one of Kate's frying pans. They're all inside the house talking about birthing babies. They'll be a while. If possible, his grin stretched even wider as he lowered his lips to hers. Then I suppose I'd better seal the deal. The next day, Carter pulled a new axe head from the forge as shouts filled the air in town. Had there been an explosion at the mine? The windows were open to allow airflow, meaning he heard the hustle and bustle in town most days. Tossing the axe head into the water he used to cool it off, Carter wrenched off the leather apron he used while working and hurried through the door to the smithy. Liam Pratt stood in the middle of town with a group of men, looking every bit the lawman he was, as he barked orders. Every able-bodied man should come with me if you're willing to fight, but not if you're going to tuck tail and run at the first sign of trouble. Eyes locking with Carter's as he ran forward, Liam's voice grew even more grave. The train was held up just outside town, and a boy escaped to find help. We have no idea what we're running into, but there are innocent souls aboard that train. His bride could be aboard that train, at least the woman meant to be his bride. They didn't come into Mud Lake every day, and the letter told him she was on her way. He'd rehearsed what he planned to say to her most of the night, and Samuel had already offered her a place to stay at the ranch until she determined what it was she wanted to do. He and Mia had prayed about it together as well, but it was really down to how she responded. She could be comfortable at the Pratt Ranch if she didn't want to go back to New Orleans. Perhaps she'd be disappointed, but maybe she'd be relieved? Still, as he mounted one of the horses the liveryman brought out into the street for those who didn't own their own horses, dread thumped through his body with every beat of his heart. What if she was hurt? Killed? He couldn't abandon an injured woman, particularly one who'd come to town for the sole purpose of marrying him. They rode fast and hard the few minutes outside town to where the train had pulled to a stop and folks stood, knelt, and lay outside it. Holding up his badge, Liam took in the scene with Carter beside him. Two men lay on the ground, puddles of blood beneath them. Another man sat on the steps of the train with a rapidly swelling bruise on his face and holding his arm to his side gingerly. Another man lay a little further down, but a woman sat beside him dabbing his forehead and wrapping his leg in strips of cloth. Nearby, a crowd gathered and knelt to the ground. Worry rolled off them, and both Carter and Ethan hurried that direction. No matter if the threat still remained, they were physicians first of all. Carter may not be in practice, but there wasn't an emergency he wouldn't run into if lives were at stake. Threat is neutralized, Liam shouted from where he spoke to the train's engineer. The two dead men were with the gang who held up the train, but the rest managed to escape before they could be captured. Excuse us, Ethan said as he pushed through the crowd. He held his bag, face set into a grim expectation of what he was to find. Carter followed, ready to do anything his friend needed. Please let the doctors through. The woman on the ground looked to be in her early 20s, but the life had all but seeped from her skin as the wound pulled around her middle. She had dark hair, long from what he could see, but her blue dress was soaked with blood from her waist down the skirt. It was as though she'd tried to escape after being shot, a brave act if a foolish one. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, pulling clean gauze from his bag. Does anyone know her name? He grabbed scissors as well, preparing to cut the saturated fabric that almost looked purple in the bright sun. Who is this woman? Her name's Tori, the woman who knelt at her head and stroked her hair said shakily. She told me about herself on the way from New Orleans. She's my daughter's age, and we got to know each other a little on the way out. The woman sniffed, tears flowing down her cheeks. She's here as a mail order bride. Chapter 14. Mia moved down the steps to the clinic that morning feeling as though she floated rather than walked. The kiss from Carter the evening before at the ranch had been sweet and chaste, but there was a beauty about it she'd carry with her for the rest of her life. Smoothing a small wrinkle on her brand new dress, Mia raised her hand to stifle a happy yawn. She'd been unable to sleep much the night before, reminiscing instead on Carter's declaration of feelings, so she finished the light green dress she'd been working on for weeks. Would Carter like it? Never in her life had Mia considered whether a man would like a dress she designed and created, but she did now. The sound of footsteps on the wood floor in the clinic told Mia at least Grace was downstairs already, likely holding baby Nehemiah as she did most days. The baby was a little more than a month old, settling into his life either strapped to one of his parents' chests or sleeping in his bassinet in the clinic. It wouldn't always work, that much everyone knew, but it did for the time being. Suddenly feeling very deprived of baby snuggles, despite the fact she'd held him just the night before, Mia grinned as Grace glanced up from where she tidied up. Good morning. That green color looks beautiful on you. It did, and she was either vain or confident enough to admit it. Thank you. I just finished it. I want to see what Lizzie thinks about me working up a few patterns to sell in the mercantile. Oh, that would be wonderful. Now, are you going to tell me what has you so smiley this morning, or are you going to pretend it's the dress? Grace's brow rose, and Mia knew exactly where her sister's thoughts had gone. While none of them had pried into the situation with her and Carter, it was clear their friends had noticed the two of them out by the pasture the day before. They'd stood and talked for a while after the kiss, and at one point, she'd looked over and seen at least 3 of the women's faces pressed against the back window spying on them. Happiness spread across her face, far stronger than any coy games she might prefer to play. Carter kissed me last night. It was sweet, and very quick, but I felt like my feet lifted a mile off the ground. Suddenly, her legs felt like they were made of jelly, and she plopped into a chair in the waiting room. Grace, wearing a sleeping Nehemiah, sat down next to her and took her hand. I'm happy for you, but how much has he shared with you about his past? How much could she tell her sister without breaking Carter's confidence? He'd not shared the details of his life for a reason, and it wasn't her place to tell. Not much other than he grew up in Chicago and left medicine after a few years to apprentice under a blacksmith. He didn't seem to want to talk about it, so I didn't push. There, that was true, it just wasn't the whole truth. Before Grace could respond, the front door swung open, and Ethan hurried through. Grace, I'm going to need your help. Can you give Mia to Mia for a bit? Carter followed after Ethan, holding an eerily still and bloodied woman in his arms. Oh, Lord be with her, Mia prayed quietly as she took Nehemiah from her sister and tried not to jostle him. Blood coated both Ethan and Carter, but it was clearly the woman who was wounded. What happened? The train was held up outside town, Liam answered quickly as he stepped through the door. This young woman was shot first, and she's lost a great deal of blood. These two gentlemen were injured taking the assailant down, but they'll need to be checked out as well. Two other men followed with Liam, taking seats in the waiting room as Carter, Ethan, and Grace all hurried into the examination room. Just then, baby Nehemiah started wiggling, and his face got red and scrunched. Knowing exactly what that meant, Mia stood and hustled to get a fresh diaper. Unfortunately, they were all in the kitchen behind the examination room, and the only door to enter was through said room. She'd barely cracked the door when she spotted the baby's bag placed on a chair just inside the exam room, close enough she could probably slip in and out without being noticed. She just laid a hand on it when Grace swept the woman's dark hair away from her face, the sight familiar though far paler than normal. Without thinking, Mia gasped. Oh, goodness. Gracie, is that Dash? This is Tori Hammond, Carter said as though the words physically pained him to say. He backed away from the exam table, shoulders hunching forward in shame. He wouldn't look at her, but his mouth kept moving. My mail-order bride. Carter sat outside the clinic with his head in his hands. Had it only been that morning when he'd heard the bells and ran out to see what was happening? Tori still hadn't woken from her unconscious state, probably a blessing with as much pain as she'd be in when she finally did wake. Somehow, the bullet had missed any major organs, but it had taken every bit of knowledge and experience from Ethan, Grace, and himself to get her stable enough to have even a prayer of making it out the other side. Speaking of Grace, the new mom paced inside the clinic, doing some sort of whisper yell to her husband as she moved back and forth across the floor. Mia had taken the baby over to their house for a nap, and it wouldn't surprise Carter a bit if it was him the woman's sister was so angry with. She couldn't see him though, at least not in her current position, so he stayed where he was in the swing on the clinic's front porch, wondering what in the world he was supposed to do. It was another half hour or so before Grace had moved out the back of the clinic, presumably to head towards their house, and Ethan had gone back into the patient room to check on Tori. At least the men who'd fought so hard to save the rest of those on the train had lived with only minor injuries. By the time the sun started to set, Carter's stomach growled, and he realized he hadn't eaten since breakfast. A soft voice from behind him startled him from his racing thoughts, as Mia walked around the side of the clinic before climbing the steps. She stood in front of him with what looked to be a wrapped sandwich, holding it in his direction. Sounds like you could use this. Her eyes, so trusting and full of hope the day before, were now wary, much like Phoenix as she tried to decide who she could trust. With a deep, shuddering breath, Carter wondered how long it had been since he had last cried. Probably years, if not decades, but seeing the woman of his dreams there before him and knowing exactly what he had to do next threatened to tear his heart right out of his chest. Mia, he croaked softly. The tears came, not quite spilling over just yet, but they were all the same. I'm so sorry. This time, it was her whose eyes remained dry. She nodded, clenching her eyes shut and pulling her lips between her teeth. So this is it, then. You're taking back everything you said yesterday? Her words were quiet, but there wasn't venom in her tone. No, it was far worse, the heartbreak and betrayal he deserved laced the sound. No, he said as he placed the sandwich beside him on the swing and stood to his feet. As though of their own accord, his hands came up to rest on her arms only for his mind to register the action just short of disaster. He couldn't touch her, not when his bride lay fighting for her life on the other side of the wall, and every move he made would be etched in Mia's mind forever. I meant it all. I love you, Mia, but I can't abandon Tori. She nearly died coming out here to marry me, she may still die. I can't walk away from her, not when there's so much at stake. She'd need so much support in the coming days, and it was possible she'd never have the same physical ability she'd had before. They wouldn't know the extent of the damage for weeks yet, and nothing in him would allow him to walk away from her now. Mia swallowed thickly, taking a step back away from him. It was only then he noticed how beautiful she looked in her light green dress, the color of new, fresh grass in the spring. I understand. She may have deficits for the rest of her life, and you made an agreement with the agency. Her words were clipped, devoid of any emotion, and that might have been even worse than the hurt before. Have a good life, Carter. I hope you're both happy together. As she turned on her heel and hurried down the steps, the dam holding back Carter's tears broke and flowed down his face like the mountain rivers which flowed into the streams on Samuel's property. He buried his face in his hands, and darkness had nearly fallen when a pair of heavy boots sounded on the steps before him. Looking up, Carter saw Samuel Pratt moving towards him with equal parts worry and sympathy in his gaze. He didn't say anything at first, simply sat beside Carter and put his hand on his back. They sat there for a few moments before he broke the silence. Liam told me what happened. How's she doing? Tori? Or Mia? Even speaking her name felt like razor blades in his throat. Both, I guess. Tori's going to make it, we think. The bullet went pretty clean through, nicking a kidney, but we were able to get everything set back to rights. If she doesn't get some sort of infection, she should live. Past that, we don't really know. And Mia? Did the man know he'd had to walk away from her? How could he, when it had only just happened not long before? I told her I can't abandon Tori. Figured you did, Samuel said as he removed his Stetson. When Carter's face clearly showed his questions, Samuel shrugged. It's what I'd have done. You're a man of honor, Carter Hayes. You'd have done right by Tori getting her set up safely here, and you'll do right by her now that she's going to need much more support than we can give out at the ranch. He stood, facing Carter as the latter stayed seated. I know your faith is young still, and this has probably shaken it further. Know the Lord works things out for our good. The Bible tells us that, and I've seen it in my own life more times than I can count. Don't let this drive you away from him again. That didn't work so well last time. No, it didn't. He'd spent years bitter and angry, hiding so many parts of himself from the world. How can I see her? How can I sit near her at church and know I'm the one who broke her heart? You trust the one who loves her more than you could ever hope to, and you pray harder than you've ever prayed in your life that he'll work things out. Samuel placed his Stetson back atop its perch, staring off into the distance as he did so. I'll add my prayers to yours, Carter, but I have to believe he can work this evil for good. Chapter 15. Mia walked downstairs at the clinic a week later to a happy sight. Tori, the childhood friend who'd been a hair's breadth from death when she came to town, was sitting up in the patient bed just beyond the clinic's curtain. The curtains were open as well, allowing the spring sunshine to light the room with a warmth that didn't quite reach Mia's hurting heart. As she moved to enter the clinic area, the mounted mirror on the wall showed her how heavily the last week had weighed on her. Her normally shiny blonde hair was dull from lack of care. Her eyes lacked their normal luster, with bags under them, the lack of sleep clearly taking its toll. Even her clothes had paid the price. Well, not exactly paid the price, but she simply hadn't cared to put on those of prettier colors, opting instead for a dull brown she'd not worn in ages. Her throat felt raw from all the tears she'd shed over Carter walking away, and seeing him nearly every day as he spent time with Tori at the clinic had her wishing she could just sleep outside. Still, her old friend's face had finally regained some color, her light brown hair and olive skin showing the signs of life Mia's lacked. Oh, Tori, she said as she swept into the room with a genuine smile. Regardless of the situation, Tori was a good person who deserved happiness. She'd walked to the brink of death, and Carter couldn't ask for a better wife. I'm so glad you're awake. The woman sipped her tea with fervor, closing her eyes as the flavors drifted over her tongue. I don't think I've ever enjoyed honeyed tea quite so much. She placed it on the table beside her bed, sitting back on the fluffed pillows and gesturing to the chair close by. Now that I'm finally able to eat and drink again, it's like all the flavors have increased tenfold. Come, tell me all about your adventures here since you left New Orleans. My wardrobe has certainly missed you. She winked, and Mia remembered all the times she'd mended her friend's clothing after a slide at a baseball game, tears from picking roses from Mrs. Lofton's expansive gardens down the street from Hope House, or treating them for stains after she was creative in the kitchen. I can't even imagine the state of them. I'll mend every piece before your wedding if you like. The words sat like ice picks in her heart, but she did her best to smile through the pain. If she was being honest, she respected Carter all the more for refusing to abandon Tori after her injuries. It would be weeks before she'd be up and walking without assistance, months before she could travel again. The bullet hadn't hit any major organs, but it had done a fair amount of damage as it entered and exited her body. Tori's eyes narrowed, but kindness remained in them. Are you all right, Mia? You seem, I don't know, different. She was different. She was a woman who'd fallen in love with the groom of the woman before her. Guilt, heartbreak, and longing were her constant companions, and she had no doubt they would be for some time. Still, the Lord was near to the broken-hearted, and it would be only him who'd bind up the shattered pieces of hope that lay at her feet. It's been a hard few weeks, but I'll be all right. I'm more interested in what convinced you to join Mrs. Miller's agency. It wouldn't surprise me if you got yourself into some sort of trouble, she said with a smirk. I'm curious what that trouble might be. Tori grinned, unable to burst into her normally boisterous laughter due to her injuries. Actually, I didn't get into any trouble at all. I've been working as the Hope House cook for a year now, as you know, but day after day doing the same thing had almost bored me to tears. I felt like if I didn't do something, I'd simply crawl out of my skin. She shook her head, reaching for her tea again. I didn't bargain for this type of excitement when I decided to come west, but it's certainly been an adventure. Adventure? It had always been a core motivator for her confident and bold friend. That, and the occasional risk of danger. The excitement had gotten her put on restriction over the years from the house mothers, but they all adored her loquacious nature and infinite energy. She brought up the mood of any room she walked into, and she was impossible not to like. That, it has. They chatted a while longer, with Tori filling Mia in on all the happenings at Hope House, when the bell above the clinic's door jingled and Mia felt Carter's presence before she even turned to see who it was. He visited every day, so it wasn't like it was a surprise, but still the sight of him gutted her every time. Good morning, ladies, Carter said thickly as he crossed the threshold to the patient room. Tori, I'm glad to see you sitting up and drinking this morning. Grace said I could try some tea, she said with a wide grin. Completely unaware of the tension rolling off the other two occupants of the room, Tori took another sip of tea. It even tastes like a mountain spring. Carter's brow rose, his lip quirking upward slightly in amusement. How so? It's got honey, lavender, mint, and other herbs Grace thought would help with my healing. I'm not even certain what all she put in it, but it smells heavenly. I'm taking the opportunity to stare out at these beautiful mountains while I sip it and do a little daydreaming of all the adventures we'll have there soon. As her friend turned that excitement away from the window and towards Carter, Mia rose and brushed off her drab, brown skirt. I'll let you two visit for a while. Grace should be back in soon. Tori, make sure you don't do too much. She'd walk over hot coals if it meant she could leave the presence of Tori's effortless charm wooing the man who haunted every single dream she had. Swallowing back tears she hoped desperately neither could see, Mia rushed from the room before either could respond. Once out the back door, she realized it was time to head over to the mercantile anyway. Good, Coralie and Timothy's sweet innocence would feel like a balm to her spirit. If nothing else, their hugs would hold her together until the Lord brought her the peace for which she prayed. That evening, Carter stepped out onto the front porch of the clinic and ran a hand over his face. He'd stayed for about an hour that morning, visiting until Tori had started to yawn, and Grace shooed him out so the patient could nap. He'd gone back at dinner, bringing food from the restaurant to give Grace the night off from cooking. Mia hadn't been there the second time he'd gone, but that was probably a good thing. As much as he longed to see her every time he walked through the doors, it felt like he left a part of his soul behind every time he walked past her to sit by Tori's bedside. His bride was beautiful, lovely and lively in a way he'd never quite known before. Still, there wasn't a doubt in his mind he could never love her the way he loved Mia. He could try, and he would once they said their vows, but it was a fool's errand. Was it fair to her? Probably not. She'd need far more care than that of the clinic once she was discharged, and she was his responsibility. The front door to the clinic opened again, and Ethan stepped outside. Between him and Samuel, the one positive thing in all this was Carter had continued to move back towards the faith he'd walked away from after Eleanor's accident. His friend clapped a hand on his shoulder, fully aware of everything that had happened after Carter came clean a few nights before. He didn't speak, just stood there in silent support as Carter fought to keep control of his emotions. "I saw her this morning," Carter said quietly. "She's hurting, and it's all my fault." It was his fault. All of it was. If he hadn't sent off for a mail-order bride, Tori wouldn't be laid up in a hospital bed, and Mia wouldn't be walking around like she hadn't slept a wink in 6 months. Both of them were in pain, one physical and the other a much deeper kind. Ethan grunted, not denying his assertion. "So are you." Carter turned his gaze on Ethan, the blonde doctor wise beyond his years from what Carter had experienced. "What am I supposed to do? How can I marry someone I don't love when the woman of my dreams is right here in town?" He ran his hand through his hair, gripping the ends until he felt a twinge of pain. "I can't leave Tori alone either. She was on that train because of me, and she'll have at least 4 months of healing because of that decision. Not to mention, I got another letter this morning. My grandfather's had another stroke. If he hasn't passed already, he only has a few weeks at the most." That had been another thing he'd come clean to Ethan and Samuel about in the last week. They knew it all, save the part about Mia being attacked by the trappers. That part was her story to tell, but they knew the rest. Both of them had prayed with him, reminding him none of this caught the Lord unaware, but it felt nearly impossible to take the reassurance to heart. Ethan took a seat on the swing outside the clinic, staring off into the setting sun over the mountains as he sat in silence. Finally, when Carter felt like he'd break the porch railing as tightly as he squeezed, he let it go and joined his friend. It felt very similar to the week before when he and Samuel had sat on this very bench and the cowboy told him to trust the Lord, even in this. Ethan had told him much the same thing, more than once, but it still felt impossible. "You know, there was a time during the smallpox outbreak I wondered if I was going to make it. I laid in that bed, worried sick about Grace treating all those patients on her own, especially while pregnant. One day, when she was out visiting half the town, and you were trying to track down some vaccines, I hit my lowest point." Carter hadn't heard this part of the story. He'd worked with Grace to help stem the spread of the outbreak, with the town somehow avoiding any casualties. He didn't sense Ethan needed a response, so he didn't give one. "My head pounded worse than it ever had in my whole life, my fever high enough I was freezing despite sweating bullets. I couldn't keep a sip of water or a bite of food down, and I couldn't have told you my own name aloud. Still, in that dark place, I cried to the Lord in my mind. I asked him if he'd brought me Grace only to take me away from her so quickly. We'd barely even had a meal together as man and wife before tragedy struck, banging on our door the day of the wedding." Ethan sat back on the bench, still staring straight ahead at the mountains in the distance. "I was angry, and I was confused. God reminded me of a scripture I'd read many times but never quite seen in this light." "What scripture was that?" Carter was desperate for something, anything that would help guide him. "I remembered the story of Job. Are you familiar with it? The man who'd lost his whole family and all his earthly treasures as some sort of test to see how faithful he was?" Yes, it was one of the stories he'd taken issue with during his crisis of faith. "I am." Then you may remember the moment where Job cries out to God, angry and confused as well. God doesn't shy away from his cries, and certainly, he scolds Job a bit for questioning him, but he also reminds the man who is in control. That, when we search with the right heart, is comforting. Folks pass, suffering happens, you know this well. No matter what happens in your relationship with Mia, Tori, or anything else, Scripture tells us the Lord works things together for his glory and our good. Samuel said something similar, Carter said as he thought about all that had brought them to that point. He's been through the fire too, Ethan replied. He knows what it feels like to have no choice but to trust the Lord with the thing you hold most dear. He'd lost it in his mother, and he's gained it once again in Kate. Like with Job, God sees things with a perspective we do not. If the answer isn't something we want, how do we accept that? He'd never been so vulnerable with anyone as he was with these men who'd acted as shepherds for his faith in Mud Lake, but he had no doubt the Lord had sent them for a reason. Ethan sighed, his mind clearly on the past. At that point, we beg God for the peace only he can give. He doesn't promise we'll always be happy with the outcome, but he does promise us peace if we surrender our will to his. Chapter 16. By the time spring melted into summer, the last of the snowfall long gone, Mia was tempted to curse the beautiful land she now lived in because of its stark contrast to her own stormy heart. That Sunday morning, as she'd walked down to the church early for a time of prayer, the blue sky seemed to mock her. Birds chirped, wildlife grazed unbothered by her presence as she stood in the field beside the steeple and stared out at the clearing of wildflowers framed by woods at their back. Tori had made great strides in her recovery, but there was still question about her ability to walk any real distance, as it was something they just have to watch and see. She'd told Mia she and Carter planned to marry at the end of June. Their relationship was amicable, built on friendship with the hope of something more in the future. Unfortunately, as much as she wished for the happiness of both of them, the truth of what that would mean for her continued to rain down in an icy flow. How long she stood there praying for the Lord to bring her peace, she didn't know, but at some point a pair of footsteps behind her broke her from her thoughts. Without even turning around, she knew exactly who owned them. Carter had wormed his way so readily into her heart, his very presence felt familiar to her. As much as their separation grated her soul, something about him still brought peace. "Glad it's finally warmed up," Carter said softly. His voice, the few times he'd spoken to her over the last month, wasn't the same as it was when he spoke to Tori. With her, it was gentle and kind, but with Mia it felt forced. "Is that a new dress?" The fabric was, the buttery yellow complementing her fair hair and skin in a way she hadn't initially suspected when Lizzie first showed it to her. There were small white flowers on the bodice, and she'd added accents as well. Somewhere in her heart, she'd hoped the sunshine yellow dress would reflect on her own healing a little, but it hadn't yet. "Yes. I just finished it this week." "It's beautiful," he croaked. At the sound, Mia turned and saw a man who looked nearly as broken as she was. There were bags under his eyes as well, his hair mussed as though he'd already run his hands through it multiple times that morning. She couldn't see the main churchyard from where they stood, slightly behind the structure and away from prying eyes. As many tears as she shed these days, it was probably a good thing. "Thank you. I was hoping some of that would rub off on me." Carter closed the distance between them, but he stopped short a little over a foot from her. Clenching his fists, as though trying to hold them back from touching her, he shook his head. "You have all the beauty you could ever want already. No dress can add to or take away from that." It was on the tip of her tongue to scold him for saying something like that to her as an almost married man, but what came out of her mouth was entirely different. "Carter, I miss you. I know I shouldn't, but seeing you with Tori every day breaks my heart over and over again." Carter's eyes filled with tears, and something about seeing the mountain of a man brought down by the overflow of his own emotions filled her own eyes. "I can't abandon her, Mia. I plan to let her down gently and get her set up once she arrived here, you know that, but she's going to need months of care. If I break things off now, I'd never respect myself, and you wouldn't respect me either." A sob tore from her chest, and Mia nodded as the overwhelming desire to curl up on the ground and stay there for the foreseeable future nearly overtook her. "Then where will that leave us? Longing for one another for the rest of our lives? Or do you think you can fall for her instead, leaving me in this all by myself?" I know I'm being selfish, and I hate myself for it. I can't live the rest of my life wondering if what we had was real. It was, Carter said as his hand broke free from its fist and cupped her cheek. It shook, as though he tried to hold it back and couldn't. It is, but she doesn't expect love from me. She expects me to be a faithful provider and protector, that much I can do. I'll love you until the day I die, Mia Middleton, and I'll always be here if you need me. He dropped his hand, the sound of it slapping his pant leg like a shot to her heart. I have to live up to my word. She's injured because of me. One woman is already dead because of me, and I'm the one who made this mess. I have to clean it up. Eleanor. He'd blame himself for her death for years if the Lord didn't work to convince him otherwise. Mia couldn't speak, but she didn't have to. Behind Carter's broad build, moving around the corner of the church, came Grace and Ethan. Grace held the baby, and Ethan pushed Tori's wheelchair she'd used to move more than a few steps for a few more weeks. Tori's eyes were dry, but tears flowed down Grace's cheeks. It was clear they'd heard everything. Still, Tori placed her hands on the arms of her chair and used them to push to standing. She looked beautiful, the light blue dress Mia recognized as one of Mara's complementing her olive complexion beautifully. Is it true? Her expression was blank as she faced Carter, her head cocked to the side in question. Did you fall in love with Mia before I arrived? She took a stuttering step towards them, and Carter held out his hand to steady her from the front while Ethan did the same from the back. I did, but I'm not abandoning you, Tori. We'll go ahead with our plans. I'm a man of my word, especially when you nearly died because of me. It was then that fire flashed in Tori's eyes, and her lip turned up in a smirk. You're lucky it hurts me to even breathe right now, Carter Hayes, or I'd laugh in your face for that. It's not your fault I got hurt. The only people at fault are the men who now lie in the ground and the rest of the gang which managed to get away. They're responsible. If you're in love with Mia, marry her. Look at the two of you, you might be an even more adorable couple than Ethan and Grace, and I didn't think that was possible. Her eyes fell to Mia then, and she took another slow step towards her. Mia, do you truly love him the way you said? Will you love him the rest of your days, raising his babies and reminding him just how beautiful life can be? Her eyes sparkled, and she smiled then. Tori, Carter interrupted. You may never have the same stamina you once did. You may never walk without a cane. We still don't know what type of deficits you'll have, and abandoning you to deal with all that on your own would be unthinkable. Tori slowly shifted her body to face them both. Carter, you don't know me very well, but not much keeps me down. I should have died in childbirth with my mother, but somehow the neighbor's wife managed to revive me. Then, I nearly lost my leg at 5 due to an infection my father refused medical care for. That part Mia knew. Apparently, her father had been against any formal medical care, and it's part of what got Tori removed from his home at around 10. I begged for food for years, slept in a rat-infested tenement apartment, and was left on my own for days at a time while my father spent more time at the gambling hall than he did at home. Tori, Mia breathed softly. I know what I said, but dash. But nothing, Tori replied softly. You're my friend, and I can't wait to attend your wedding. She turned her attention back to Carter. Like I said, you don't know me, but there's no way I won't find my way after this as well. The house mothers call me stubborn, but I prefer strong-willed. Either way, I'll be just fine. Why, you're all right with this? Mia could barely believe what her friend was saying. She was giving them her blessing, even when it meant she'd be alone here in Colorado? You don't want to marry Carter? I don't want to marry a man who is clearly head over heels for someone else. I want a man who I can at least hope to one day love me the way Carter clearly loves you. That man isn't Carter, because he's already taken. She took Mia's hands in hers, her grin growing even wider. I deserve that hope, Mia, and so do you. Don't hate yourself for it, she said with a wink. Yes, we'd been there for a moment, but I assume you'll forgive me for eavesdropping. Turning to Carter, whose mouth hung open in disbelief, Tori reached out to take his hand once more as she shuffled back to her chair. Treat her well, Hayes. Take her home, claim your fortune, sign it over to your mother and sisters, and come back so I get to watch my friend raise your babies." She chuckled, then winced. I really need to remember not to laugh. Staring the both of them down, Tori settled back into her seat. "Be happy, and don't worry about me. I'm like a cat, always landing on my feet when I need to." With that, she motioned for Ethan to turn her chair and take her back towards the front of the church. Grace followed, but not before exchanging a wide-eyed look with Mia first. As they disappeared, Carter turned back to face Grace, this time closer than he'd been the moment before. "I guess I don't know what to say," he said as he brought his hand up once more. This time, his hand didn't shake as it settled there on her cheek, his thumb gently stroking her skin. "If this is what you want, say the word. I'll stand up in front of the church today and tell them what's happening so no one questions your character." She hadn't even thought of that. "I don't care what the rest of them think. Can we just tell everyone from Hope House at lunch today? We're all going to Liam and Mara's, right?" He nodded, his smile reaching his eyes for the first time she'd seen since Tori arrived. "That, we are." Pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, hand still softly on her cheek, Carter took a deep breath. His words, spoken against her skin, were so low she barely heard them. "Thank you, Lord," he breathed. "Thank you." Chapter 17. Every woman who journeyed west from Hope House stood in the master bedroom of Tessa and Ben's home and watched as Grace placed a veil atop Mia's head. It was warm outside, as July had brought with it a heat not often seen in the mountains of Colorado, but it also brought an even more stunning showing of summer wildflowers and the bluest sky Mia thought she'd ever seen. "Oh, Mia," Kate said as she placed a hand over her mouth. "You look so beautiful." "Of course she does," Lizzie said as she swept into the bedroom with a gorgeous bouquet of wildflowers tied with twine. "Has she ever looked anything but?" Tears trickled down Grace's cheeks, as well as Paige's, but it was Tori who Mia sought. Her old friend sat on the bed in a beautiful light green dress Mia had given her after she lost all her dresses in the train holdup. She didn't look one bit the jilted bride, one effectively left at the altar, but guilt still pricked at Mia's chest. Approaching the bed and kneeling in front of her so her still healing friend wouldn't have to stand, Mia took Tori's hands in hers. "Tor, I need to know you're going to be all right. I don't know. I feel like I've pulled the rug out from under you." Tori chuckled, shaking her head as she scooted forward on the bed. She didn't even grimace anymore when she laughed, though thankfully she'd reached the point in her healing where she could walk short distances without difficulty. Placing her palms on either side of Mia's face, she forced the bride to look her in the eyes. "Mia, do you love him as much as it seems like you do?" "Yes," Mia responded without hesitation. "Then why in the world would I ever stand in the way of that? Besides, I'm moving out to the ranch this week to help Kate and Clarence keep everyone there fed." She winked and lowered her voice to a stage whisper. "Have you seen all the handsome cowboys at that place? I'll be just fine." She winked, and every woman in the room laughed. "It'll be an adventure, and that's really what I came here for." Mara shook her head, placing her hands on her hips as she cocked her head to the side. "You be sure to run any of those cowboys past Samuel before you give any of them the time of day." "Now," she said as she placed a gentle hand under Mia's arm to help her rise. "I'm going to tell you what I've told every Hope House girl in this room before they married, with the exception of Kate. You don't have to do this. You have family here, you have people to fall back on. I know you love Carter, but no, marriage is a choice you're making. It's not something any woman who comes here should feel like she has to do." Mara, ever the protector. It was a different circumstance since Mia and Carter were truly marrying for love, and in this instance, he needed her more than she needed him. His grandfather wouldn't live much longer, that much was clear, and they planned to take their wedding trip back home to Chicago so he could introduce her to his family and hopefully say goodbye to his grandfather. It had been nearly a year since his first stroke, but he'd had another since, and he'd only grown weaker with time. "This is everything I want. If the offer's still good, I'll take all of you as my family." Mia pulled Mara into a hug, then reached to take Grace's hand. It had been Mara's wedding dress she borrowed, though she'd added some embellishments with Mara's blessing. She'd originally considered making her own dress, but it would have delayed the wedding so much to order the fabric it didn't feel worth it. Grace and I are more thankful for each of you than you know. With a few of the women dabbing at their eyes, they descended into a group hug with Mia in the middle. After a moment, Mara cleared her throat and checked her watch. Ladies, I do believe it's time to get our girl to the church. She's got a groom waiting on her. Carter shifted back and forth from foot to foot as he stood at the front of the church. The ceremony would be starting in less than a minute, and Tessa had already taken her place behind the piano to provide soft hymns in the background of the town's chatter. Everyone was there, every family who'd been formed from the Hope House brides coming to town, and many of those who'd been there for years. Even a contingent of the men he'd worked with at the mine had somehow managed to get cleaned up and into town. Ethan's aunts and uncle sat 3 rows back from the front, just as they did every Sunday, and 4 or 5 of Samuel's ranch hands he'd gotten to know in the process of working with them had come as well. Clarence, the aging ranch cook who kept the cowboys in the bunkhouse fed, grinned wide as he caught Carter's eye, elbowing Joshua in the side next to him. He raised a brow at the wrangler who turned bright red, and Carter realized he'd pointed towards Tori in the second row with Mara, Paige, and their children. Tori held one of Mara's twins in her lap, and Carter held back a chuckle at the cowpoke's antics. As Joshua's cheeks went from pink to beet red, a tap on the shoulder pulled him from the scene and Samuel's voice broke through the music. "Are you ready for this?" He'd asked Samuel to stand up with him since Ethan would be walking Mia down the aisle. Grace would stand for Mia, and he'd gotten closer and closer to the cowboy in the time they'd been meeting to discuss things of faith. "More ready than I've ever been for anything." It was interesting. The thought of a wedding day with Eleanor had never been something Carter looked forward to. It had always been a duty, something he'd happily accepted as a marriage built on friendship and mutual respect. As the music swelled and the back doors to the church opened, he knew with no doubt his heart would only ever race that way for Mia. Grace walked first, beautiful as always in her light pink dress with small blue flowers dotting the skirt. She held a small bouquet of wildflowers, and her hair had been pulled up into an elegant bun Carter had no doubt had rendered Ethan speechless. All of a sudden, the music changed once, morphing into something he'd never heard before, something he had no doubt Tessa had written for this moment. Ethan and Mia appeared in the door, his friend in a smart gray suit and a wide smile that blurred next to the radiance of his bride. She wore a white dress with lace rising from the bodice up to clasp around her neck and also extending down her arms. The waist cinched in with a belt adorned with blue stitching that matched spots of detail on the hem and skirt of her dress. Her hair was pulled half back, curled somehow with a veil which flowed down her back. Still, the most beautiful part of the whole picture was the tear-filled smile of his bride as she stepped slowly down the aisle with Ethan, her eyes fixed on his to the point he barely registered Ben or Samuel's presence behind him. Grace dabbed at her eyes from her position as matron of honor, and Carter knew if he lived 1,000 lifetimes, he'd never see a sight more beautiful than the one before him. Mia held a bouquet of wildflowers too, this one much bigger than Grace's, and somehow the colors pulled everything together in perfect harmony. She was an artist, she knew colors like the back of her hand, but this time she'd been the canvas. It was a masterpiece, created in God's image and joining together under a union Carter had no doubt he'd brought together. "Thank you, Lord. We didn't always know how this would turn out, but you never left us in the wilderness and waiting. Thank you for this woman and the life we'll have together. Thank you for the opportunity to keep my mother and sisters in their home. Thank you for the home we'll build here, the family we've found here, and the faith you've rekindled in me. Thank you." Chapter 18. Mia wiped her hands on the skirt of her baby blue and white gingham dress for what had to be the 10th time that morning. They'd boarded the train in Sawyer's Pass the day after their wedding, and they'd arrived in Chicago that morning after a surprisingly comfortable journey. Carter had paid for them to have a sleeper car, something far more spacious than she'd experienced on her journey from New Orleans. "Are you sure they're going to like me? We married so quickly. What if they think I'm after your inheritance?" Not normally given to such anxiety, her desperation for her mother-in-law and sisters-in-law to welcome her into the family surprised her. Carter wrapped his arm around her in the coach they'd hired to take them from the train station to his family's home, and she could barely enjoy the views around her due to her rolling stomach. "Just breathe, love," he said softly as he pressed a kiss to her hair. He lingered there for a moment, longer than was proper this far east, but he didn't seem to care. They're going to love you, but it wouldn't matter if they didn't. You're my wife, and they'll all accept that. Shuddering breaths were all she could manage, her heart racing as the coach pulled to a stop in front of a beautiful brownstone in the heart of the wealthiest neighborhood she'd seen. Hope House had been in the Garden District of New Orleans, and those homes had been quite something to see. Something about the divide between the wealthiest in Chicago and their simple life back in Mud Lake felt even more stark. Carter stepped down, paid the coach driver, and held out a hand for Mia as the driver took their bags. He wore his Sunday clothes, though he didn't wear a suit jacket, and Mia spotted a frayed spot on his shirt she'd fix as soon as they got back home. Leaning down, Carter spoke softly into her ear. His breath tickled as he whispered, and it sent a shiver down her spine. "Have I told you today how beautiful you look, Mrs. Hayes?" The feel of his hand on her lower back, the sound of his voice, the words of his praise, they all served to bring her feet back to the ground for the moment. "Only about a dozen times, Mr. Hayes, but you can tell me as many times as you wish." She managed a small smile and tried to take in the sight of the house her husband had grown up in. It was undoubtedly beautiful. The rich, reddish-brown brick which made up the structure was accented by white shutters and a dark gray roof. It was 3 stories tall, narrower than the home in New Orleans, but clearly had just as much space. A bay window stood in the front, but the curtains were drawn with a rich, cream-colored tapestry. Ivy climbed the side, and landscaping that looked to have once been impeccable had begun to grow over. Carter let out a long sigh. "They must have had to let the gardeners go," he said as he apparently noticed the same thing. The wrought iron fence was in good condition, but the porch needed to be swept. "Listen, Mia, I'm not sure what exactly we'll find inside. I need you to know I had a good childhood here. My family was very loving, and it's only Uncle Pruitt who has caused this mess. Whatever the stress has done here, know that it was once beautiful." Mia lifted her hand to Carter's cheek, reveling in her right to touch it often now they were married. Raising to her tiptoes, Mia pulled him the rest of the way towards her to press a gentle kiss to his lips. "I wouldn't dream of passing judgment. I'm here to help, Carter, and to support you as much as I can. Whatever you need from me, just say the word." He pressed their foreheads together, the two of them still and silent in the early morning hustle and bustle that surrounded them. Despite the busyness of the Chicago streets, it felt like they were the only ones in the world. "Thank you for being here," he said thickly. "Nothing seems quite as bad if you're beside me." Then, hand in hand, Carter led me up the steps to his family's home. The large, ornate door knocker was shaped like a lion, and it seemed to echo both outside and within as Carter made their presence known. This was the home where he had been raised, whatever lay within, but Mia couldn't help but wonder if the lion on the door was a sign of things to come. No one opened the door for around a minute, and Carter's heart began to beat faster. Was he too late? Had he missed the news of his grandfather's passing and Uncle Pruitt had already sold the home? The curtains were drawn, and he could see no real sign of life. "Hello," he called as he pushed open the front door. "Mother? Is anyone home?" Relief swept over him as his mother appeared at the top of the stairs, followed closely by both his sisters. Marnie had a wide grin spread across her beautiful face, having grown into quite the beauty since he'd last seen her. She was 16 now, and her brown hair and fair skin would surely make her the belle of all the balls within a few years. "Carter." In a move wholly unladylike, Marnie shifted around her mother and flew down the stairs. "I knew you'd come. I told them you would, but Beth Ann didn't believe me." The other two floated down the stairs in a far more demure manner, Mother's dress nearly matching the dark maroon wallpaper in its finery. She was as well dressed as she'd ever been, but Carter didn't miss the new lines in her face and the bags under her eyes. The room was darker than normal, lit by lanterns and candles rather than the sunlight with opened curtains. Mother's bottom lip trembled, but Beth Ann only looked suspicious. She was a year younger than Marnie, her auburn hair and thin stature not what some would call traditionally beautiful, but Carter disagreed. His sister held more intelligence and wit than 10 men, always reading and writing since her lung condition had necessitated she not do too much exercise. The two of them followed Marnie down the stairs, but the latter had already flown into his arms and embraced him tightly. Carter, Mother breathed through the tears. What? How? He couldn't blame her. It had been many years since he'd been home, many years since she'd laid eyes on her son. I'm here to make sure you're taken care of, but first I want to introduce you to someone. With a raised brow, Mother seemed to take in Mia standing beside him. His wife curtsied, a small smile on her lips as she introduced herself. Hello, Mrs. Hayes. I'm Mia. You have a beautiful home, and I'm so sorry about the circumstances which brought us here, but I'm honored to meet you. Carter released Marnie and wrapped his arm around Mia. Mother, Marnie, Beth Ann, meet Mia Hayes, my wife. Both sisters' mouths dropped open at the word, and his mother's eyes widened. You married? To save us? I'd have done anything to keep you out of Uncle Pruitt's grimy hands, Carter gritted out. The fact his uncle had dared to offer marriage to his mother as a means of allowing her to earn her keep had him wishing the man was before him so he could plant a fist in his face. More so, I love Mia and she loves me. It was a little sooner than we'd have otherwise planned, but believe me, this is a love match. Mother's eyes filled with tears, but Beth Ann looked more suspicious than anything. So, she didn't marry you solely for your fortune? Does that mean you're both moving in here? You're finally coming home? Her anger was understandable. He'd left with barely a word to his sisters, and it had been 8 months since he'd first heard about grandfather's stroke. Not to mention, Beth Ann had never coped well with change. Considering I'm here to file paperwork to sign all my fortune over to you ladies upon grandfather's death, I'd say it's safe to say she didn't. Reminded of the real reason they were there, grief dampened the happiness at seeing his family again. How is he doing? It was odd, the lack of staff that had always bustled around this place. Your timing is actually miraculous, Mother said softly. He'll almost certainly pass within the week. He won't eat, and he hasn't spoken or acted like he even knows we exist for weeks. The doctors are giving him what they can to make him comfortable, but it's time. A tear trickled down her cheek, and Carter released Mia to pull his mother into a hug. I'm so sorry. Holding her there against his chest, Carter didn't even notice the figure come in through the kitchen until he heard the hammer of a pistol cock in the dark, mostly abandoned home. Welcome home, nephew, Uncle Pruitt said as he raised the barrel to point it straight at his head. I must disagree with your mother's assertion. Your timing is unfortunate at best. Chapter 19. Mia spotted the man with the gun, smartly dressed and standing over the threshold to the ornately decorated dining room to their left. Uncle Pruitt was tall, like Carter, but he was balding, and his skin was dotted with age. The buttons on his suit's vest pulled, and the creases on his pants were off-center. Uncle Pruitt, Carter growled as he maneuvered himself in front of his mother and her. Both his sisters were out of the line of fire for the moment, as they'd both been standing further from their brother. What are you doing? You made it easy for me, running away with your tail between your legs like you did. I never expected that after I had my man startle Eleanor's horse with a stone and a slingshot all those years ago, but it solved 2 of my biggest problems. Mia gasped. Uncle Pruitt had killed Eleanor, presumably to keep Carter from inheriting his grandfather's fortune. Her husband's entire body tensed, and Mia prayed desperately for an answer to get them out of this. Carter's words were low, lethal as he spoke. You killed Eleanor, and now you plan to kill me? Is that how this is going to go then? You always were a quick one, Uncle Pruitt said as he took a step forward. It's unfortunate, really. If my father hadn't taken leave of his faculties and willed everything to my brother upon his marriage and you after his death, none of this would have been necessary. Oh well, I suppose those are the hurdles we must conquer to be successful. It's a shame, really. Your bride is just as pretty as Eleanor was, maybe even more so. Perhaps I'll rethink taking your mother as my bride, after all. He leered at Mia where she stood off to the side of Carter, making her skin crawl, but it was the motion behind Uncle Pruitt that pulled her attention. As Uncle Pruitt's finger moved to the trigger, Beth Ann grabbed a large iron candelabra from the table beside her and hit the back of Uncle Pruitt's head with a thunk. Unfortunately, his finger moved just before the impact, firing the gun in a deafening sound. Call it instinct, call it divine intervention, but Mia had already begun moving to dive towards Carter, somehow catching him off balance and pushing him enough to move him from the firing line. She hit the floor with a thud, knocking the breath out of herself as she did so. "Mia!" Carter shouted as he dropped to his knees beside her. "Mia, honey, stay with me." Why did his words come out on a sob? He was safe, so was his mother. Both hovered over her with concerned faces, and it was only then she felt the searing pain in her shoulder. It radiated down her back and arm, red staining the bodice of her dress with each heartbeat. The sound of his sister's shouting and mother's tears seemed to come through a tunnel as Carter knelt at Mia's side. No. Not again. He couldn't lose Mia the way he'd lost Eleanor. His mind begged him to grab something to stem the bleeding, apply a tourniquet, and send Marnie to flag down a coach, but it was as if his body wouldn't move. It all came rushing back, the way he'd felt so helpless as Eleanor's head wound killed her so quickly, but the difference was Mia was still awake and conscious. She reached over with her uninjured arm, clasping his hand with hers. "You can do this, Carter. I trust you." With that whispered promise, the simple belief in who he was and who he could be, it was as though the ropes holding his body rigid snapped free. "Mother, get some clean cloths from the kitchen. Beth Ann, go upstairs and get one of grandfather's belts, I need to apply a tourniquet at the shoulder. Marnie, go next door and see if the Coulsons have a buggy or even a wagon we could borrow." On this street, most all of them had their own coach and drivers. They had two, at one time. Pressing a quick kiss to Mia's forehead, Carter began his general checks of her vitals without his doctor's bag. "You can trust me, sweetheart. I'm here." To her credit, Mia never once lost consciousness as he pressed hard on entrance and exit wounds to her shoulder to try and stem the tide of gushing blood. It was only the tightly applied tourniquet, the one which actually worked to slow the bleeding, that made her cry out. Tears fell silently from her eyes as he worked, and the whimper that escaped her as he lifted her to carry her to the Coulson family's coach nearly shattered his heart. Her face had gone pale from the lost blood, but her pulse still thumped steadily as he left the puddle of blood on the white tile floor of his parents' entryway. By the time they reached the hospital, he'd have given his own arm for some pain medication for her if he thought it would have made things happen sooner, but it was the face which approached her patient bed that nearly brought tears of his own. "As I live and breathe," Dr. Solomon Roche said as he took Mia's chart. "If it isn't Carter Hayes' return to Chicago." He'd been one of Carter's supervisors in the years he'd worked these very floors, teaching him more about patient care and creative medicine than any other doctor he'd worked with. "Let's get this wife of yours sorted out, and then I'd like to hear about how you're doing." They were in a shared room, but the other two patients had apparently been released that morning, so it was only Carter, Mia, the nurses who'd helped get Mia settled, and Dr. Roche present as he poked and prodded on the place the bullet had pierced her perfect skin. The way she gritted her teeth, tears flowing even faster down her cheeks, Carter wanted to elbow Roche out of the way and take over. He didn't for two reasons. 1. Dr. Roche was one of the most talented and brilliant physicians the hospital had ever seen. 2nd, he was only doing what he had to in order to clean the wound and ward off infection. "There we go, Mrs. Hayes," he said as he gestured for the nurses to apply bandages over the stitches. "You've been quite brave. I know that had to hurt, and I'm sorry we couldn't get you pain medication any sooner." "That's all right," Mia said with a bit of a slur. The medication they'd been able to get had finally taken effect, and Carter chuckled at how her entire countenance had changed. "I feel much better now." She was still pale, eyes drifting closed as she nodded off on occasion, but her pulse and breathing remained strong. The bullet hadn't pierced any organs. In fact, other than what Dr. Roche believed to be a fractured collarbone, she'd be getting out of this far better off than it could have been. They talked for a few moments more as Mia drifted off, and it was only then the doctor took a seat on the windowsill next to the bed. He studied Carter, his expression gentle and curious rather than angry or judgmental. "So, do you care to tell me why one of the brightest physicians I've ever worked with walked away from the profession without so much as a note to me? I've long wondered what happened to you after your betrothed passed, and I heard a rumor you'd taken up blacksmithing out west." He raised a brow, but Carter still detected nothing but curiosity in his voice. "When I originally left, it was because I'd been struck with how little control I had as a physician. It was the coward's way out, I know that now. What have you been doing since? That may be the one piece of the story that wasn't a mistake. I worked for a logging company in Vermont for a while, but I was recruited to work for a blacksmith in the camp there. He told the rest of the story of his journey west, even sharing his penchant for more artistic pieces, both beautiful and functional. He'd even come around to the idea of sending custom pieces back east to stores when he had the time. Dr. Roche listened intently, his eyes never once straying to the watch Carter knew would tell him he needed to get back to work. It was only when Carter finished he crossed his arms and leaned back against the wall. I'll say this, Hayes. I never once saw the peace and passion in you for medicine I see when you talk about being a blacksmith. I know it's probably not where you saw your life going, but you seem to have landed where you're supposed to be. Roche straightened his glasses and stood. I'll be back to check on your wife later, and my colleague has been keeping me up to date with your grandfather's condition. I'm incredibly sorry about that, Carter. I hope you know how much he loves you. Roche and grandfather had run in the same circles, both members of the same club where men would golf, smoke cigars, and complain about their wives. Well, grandfather hadn't done the latter, he'd sung grandmother's praises every time he could. I appreciate that. Do you know about my uncle's condition? It had been Beth and who swung the candelabra, and the police had been barreling down the street as he'd taken off in the Colson's coach with Mia. Roche shook his head, though his expression told Carter he'd clearly been briefed on the situation. I'm afraid not. I'm sure I'll see you around here over the next few days. Take care of yourself. It seems like you've got yourself a woman with an iron spine, hold on to her. As he moved out of the room, Carter moved slowly to his knees beside Mia's patient bed. Thank you for sparing her life, Lord. Thank you for leading me, even through winding and painful roads, to Mud Lake. When I've been faithless, you've been faithful, and I know you've directed my steps even when I couldn't see my hand in front of my face from the pain. Chapter 20. Mia stepped off the train in Mud Lake over a month later, as struck by the beauty of this place as she had been when she'd first arrived. Their return had been delayed due to her injuries and the death of Carter's grandfather a week later. The Lord had been gracious in allowing Carter one last semi-lucid conversation with the man who'd more or less raised him and given Mia the chance to meet him as well. I still can't believe you couldn't convince your mother and sisters to move here, Mia said as she stepped onto the platform, conscious not to jostle the shoulder with the arm still in a sling. I know Beth and's doctors are back east, but surely this clean air would do wonders for her condition. Carter chuckled, following her off the train and onto the platform before taking her good hand in his. I'm still working on them. Marnie says she's coming for a visit when she finishes her lessons, at least. We'll see if she gets distracted before then, but I feel at peace with where they are for the moment. And he did seem more at peace than he had since she'd met the man that cold day in December. You did what you set out to do. You inherited your fortune and signed it over to your mother, as it always should have been. Uncle Pruitt's in prison, and Beth and doesn't have his murder on her conscience. That had been a blessing in and of itself. As angry as she'd been at Carter's uncle, his sister didn't deserve to spend the rest of her life questioning her actions. She intended to save her brother, of course, but that was far more than any 14-year-old girl should have to work through. Thankfully, she'd been quickly cleared of any wrongdoing, and now the three women could live their lives in peace with the fortune Uncle Pruitt had more or less been hoarding from them since grandfather had his first stroke. Still, Mia would be lying if she didn't say she hoped they'd eventually decide to pursue the adventure of a life in the West. It wasn't always easy, but there was something about the wildness of the mountains contrasted with the calm Crystal Lake which called to Mia. She'd been antsy in Chicago, eager to get back to the mountains which had become her home. Now, as the last few weeks of summer would fade into fall, she relished the opportunity to see the whole place transform into entirely different colors. Carter carried their bags in one hand while continuing to hold hers in his other. She squeezed his palm 3 times, a sign they developed to say, I love you, without having to speak. He squeezed it back in return and pressed a kiss to her hair. Do you want to go home, or do you want to go see your sister and Nehemiah first? His lip quirked upwards, and Mia's smile widened at the thought of her nephew. Nehemiah, definitely. We can lay eyes on our land as well. As their wedding gift to the happy couple, Ethan and Grace had gifted them 2 acres of land in the same clearing where their house was located, meaning the sisters could also be neighbors. It would be some time before they were able to build, but the small apartment in the smithy would be fine until then. Honestly, as long as she was with Carter, she wouldn't have cared if they lived in a barn. Somehow, that's what I thought you'd say. Carter led them through town, both enjoying the opportunity to stretch their legs as they closed the distance to her sister's home. Do you mind if we stop at the mercantile before we go? I want to ask Paul about an order I placed before I left. Not at all. It'll give me a chance to see Coralie and Timothy as well. She'd missed those children something fierce, and she looked forward to getting back to work once her shoulder healed a little more. At the moment, it still caused her pain when moving, so she'd agreed to give it a few more weeks before trying any nannying or sewing. Still, hugging the children who she'd grown so fond of shouldn't be too difficult. The bell above the door jingled as they stepped through, and Mia felt her heart swell as Coralie and Timothy burst forward from where they'd been playing behind the counter. Miss Mia. Carter placed steadying hands on her hips as the children each collided with one of her legs, wrapping their small arms around her and squeezing her tight. Miss Mia, we were so worried about you. Coralie's little eyes misted as she looked up at her. You're going to be okay, right? Papa said you got shot. Paul rounded the counter with an apologetic grin. I told you too she was going to make a full recovery. His attention met Mia's then. We've been praying for you every night since Ethan told us what happened and you'd be delayed coming home. Touched, Mia crouched to pull the children to her with her good arm. I'm fine, and I'll be back to play with you too in a few weeks. Maybe a month, Carter said with a smirk. I know you better than to think you won't push too hard if you start back earlier. He placed a gentle hand on her elbow and helped her stand again, wrapping his hand around her waist once more. This time, rather than its purpose being to steady her, it seemed her husband wanted to touch her, and Mia wasn't complaining. Whenever you're ready, Paul said as the door opened behind them. Samuel, Joshua, and Riley stepped through donning their Stetsons and covered in dirt and mud.
Ah!
There are our returned cowboys. Welcome home. I hope the drive went well. That explained how dirty the men were, as Mia had known they typically did a cattle drive towards the end of the summer to take their beef to market in Tulsa. They were normally gone 2 weeks, from what Kate had told her, but it could be longer depending on what conditions they met on the way. It sure did, an exhausted-sounding Samuel said. I don't plan to be back in town for at least a few days, and I need to place some orders while I'm here. It was only then he noticed Carter and Mia, and a wide smile lifted his whole face. It seems we're not the only ones who've returned. Carter quickly hugged Samuel with a pat on the back. We're happy to be home. Mia, Samuel said seriously. We were sorry to hear about what happened. I hope you're healing all right. Hope House had had plenty of people who cared about her, but Mia didn't know she'd ever had quite so many in her life. Mud Lake had truly become a home, a family. I'm doing very well. Thank you for asking. I know you haven't been home yet, but how was Tori doing when you left? The plan had been for Tori to move out to the ranch a few days after Carter and Mia left for Chicago. She was going to continue recovering there before helping Kate with all the things she had going on at the ranch. Between caring for the children, growing as much food as she did, providing herbs for medicinal and culinary uses for those in town, and generally keeping house, it had to be exhausting. She's settled in nicely, Samuel said with a nod. Had a bit of a dust-up with Phoenix when she first got there thanks to a misunderstanding between her and Joshua, but all was well by the time we left. Mia looked around Samuel to the cowboy standing behind his boss, the man's face darkening at what was clearly a memory he'd rather forget. Oh goodness, I hope neither of them were hurt. They're both fine, Joshua grunted. There was clearly more to that story, but Mia would get it from Tori the next time she saw her. Boss, do you mind if I go over to the post office? I want to send our entry to Cato before we head home. Sure, Josh. We'll meet you out front when we're done. Joshua tipped his head and dipped out the door while Samuel watched him with what appeared to be equal parts worry and pride. He's going to enter a chuck wagon race from a ranch in southeastern Colorado to the stockyards in Tulsa this fall. Carter's brows drew together. What's a chuck wagon race? Samuel sighed. They're all a little different, but this one's actually a cattle drive from the ranch where it's starting to the stockyards. Each team will start out with a certain number of beeves, tagged so they know who's who. They'll earn points for speed and end weight, and the winning team wins $5,000 to split amongst themselves. $5,000? Mia couldn't even fathom that kind of money. Who's the rancher putting this on? He must be made of money. Randolph Cato of the Double C Ranch. He's got more money than he knows what to do with, and he's ready to retire the herd for now and spend time with his grandchildren. He's an eccentric old thing who loves a challenge and competition, so I reckon he's decided this is how he'd like to spend a small amount of his money. Joshua's looking to buy some land from me as a horse sanctuary for animals like Phoenix who will probably never be able to work a herd or even hold a rider, but they deserve to live out the rest of their days in peace after the rough start they had. Mia's heart broke for the beautiful mare who'd stolen her heart. That's wonderful. He won't let me give him the land, Samuel said as he rolled his eyes. Plus, he'll need money to get things set up anyway. He's got big plans for it beyond the sanctuary, but that's for him to share. Carter ran his hand up and down Mia's good arm, and she wondered if he even realized he was doing it. When does this drive take place? They'll start in the middle of November, and the hope is they'll be back by Christmas. It'll take a little longer than it does for us since the established trail is through a mountain range, and they'll have to go around it. It's too late in the year for them to go through it, so navigation and strategy is a big part of the play. Cato's been a rancher all his life, and he knew the bosses wouldn't be able to spare their hands until after the first freeze. Well, this should be interesting, Paul said as he pulled a notebook from his back pocket. Carter, I checked on your order yesterday, and we don't have an update yet. I'll let you know if we get one in this week. Samuel, you ready? I know you're itching to get home to your bride and babies. I sure am, Samuel agreed emphatically. Carter, Mia, welcome home. Y'all go get some rest. As the two of them turned to head towards Ethan and Grace's cabin, Mia settled into her husband's side, allowing his bulk to block the wind coming from off the mountains. Looking around, Mia thought of all they'd been through together, how their friendship had grown from something confusing and often frustrating to a relationship with hope and love. I'm happy to be home, Mr. Hayes. Carter pressed a kiss to her head as they rounded the corner of the clinic. Not half as happy to have you home as I am. I promise I'll get us a house built as quickly as I can. My mother actually gave us the money to build it as a wedding gift after I'd signed everything over to her, so I'm hoping to get the materials soon. It can take as long as it needs to, Mia said honestly. She paused, looking up at her husband. All I want is to be with you. Leaning down, Carter closed the distance between them until his forehead rested on hers. That, I'll always be happy to arrange. With that, he kissed her, and Mia wrapped her good arm around his neck. Loving this man would have its ups and downs. He had wounds, but so did she. Still, along the way, he'd learned to surrender his life to the Lord, and they'd simply keep doing it together for the rest of their days. Come on, Carter said as he pulled back. I know you're itching to see your nephew. He grinned wide, and Mia knew she wasn't the only one ready to snuggle the baby. It was only when they approached the yard in front of Ethan and Grace's house, the clearing in which they'd soon build their own home, Mia spotted a doe with her fawn. It looked at her, watching with the same peace it had the day at the waterfall, the heart-shaped spot in the middle of the doe's forehead a giveaway as to her identity. As the doe and her baby scampered off, Mia wrapped her arm around Carter's as they continued moving towards her sister's home. Sure, I'm the one who's itching. With a wink, she set off to see their family, ready to start on the rest of their lives. The end. Thanks for listening. Be sure you subscribe to my channel so you never miss an upload.